Rain gathers first in the gutters below the station platforms, darkening the wood in uneven streaks while the morning trains breathe smoke into the damp air. The men moving along the tracks keep their collars raised against the cold, shoulders bent slightly forward as if the weather itself has weight. Coal dust settles into cuffs and sleeves. Somewhere beyond the freight yard, metal strikes metal in slow intervals that carry through the fog like the measured knocking of distant machinery. Nothing here feels permanent. Even the buildings seem prepared to move on. A boy watches from beside the platform fencing, fingers curled around wet timber polished smooth by years of hands doing the same thing. The trains heading north carry uniforms. The trains heading south carry cotton, lumber, tobacco, and men who no longer speak much after sunset. Steam rolls beneath the wheels and disappears into the grey morning before it can fully form. He studies the conductors first, then the travellers, then the motion itself. The movement matters more than the destinations. Motion means separation. Motion means distance from whatever waits behind you. In the Georgia countryside, silence rarely arrives empty. It carries instruction inside it. There are roads you do not take after dark. Eyes you do not meet too long. Towns where a wrong gesture can settle over a family for years afterward like ash after a fire. The adults speak carefully when certain names surface at the dinner table. Stories pass between voices in fragments rather than full shapes. A man disappearing beside a roadside tree. Another leaving town overnight without warning. A cousin returning from work with blood on his collar and no explanation offered to the children watching from the doorway. The boy learns early that fear often enters a room before words do. You can hear it in the scrape of chairs against wooden floors. You can hear it in how quickly conversations end when unfamiliar footsteps pass outside the window. In the American South of the early 20th century, danger does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it settles quietly into routine until routine itself becomes difficult to separate from caution. His father speaks often about another place across the ocean. France. The word arrives inside the house like weather from a different season. In those stories, black men walk streets without lowering their eyes. Soldiers wear uniforms beside white officers. Music spills from cafes at night while strangers argue openly beneath electric light. To a child listening beside the stove, the country barely sounds real. It sounds imagined in the way exhausted people imagine water while crossing dry land. Outside, freight cars groan against their couplings. The station master walks the platform with gloved hands clasped behind his back. Somewhere farther down the line, a whistle breaks through the fog and echoes across the trees. The boy listens carefully to the sound fading into distance. Long before war enters his life, movement enters first. Years later, memory will return to these rail yards in fragments rather than complete scenes. The smell of wet iron. The blackened cuffs of workers lifting cargo before sunrise. Rainwater trembling beside the tracks whenever locomotives pass too quickly. You watch the world around him narrowing into two conditions at once: confinement and departure. One teaches endurance. The other teaches longing. Children in hard places often become observers before they become anything else. He studies gestures. Hesitations. Which streets feel safe during daylight and which fall silent too early in the evening. The body adapts quietly to caution. A lowered gaze here. A measured response there. Survival begins shaping posture before adulthood fully arrives. At night, the lamps burn low inside the house while voices drift between exhaustion and hope. Outside, insects hum beneath the heat rising from the earth after sunset. Sometimes freight trains continue moving long after midnight, carrying unknown passengers towards cities the boy cannot picture clearly. He listens from bed to the fading rhythm of wheels against steel. The sound becomes strangely comforting. Somewhere beyond the darkness, people are still moving. And movement, even imagined movement, begins to feel like freedom. Before the guns begin speaking across the continent, before uniforms reshape entire generations, take a moment to settle into the stillness beneath these streets and stations. If this quiet journey through memory and distance brings you some measure of calm tonight, you can gently subscribe and return again whenever the past still feels awake in the dark. Years pass slowly in places where the horizon appears unchanged from season to season. The same roads harden beneath wagon wheels. The same storefront windows cloud with summer dust. Men lean against fences outside feed stores discussing weather, debt, and rumors carried along the rail lines from farther north. Yet beneath the stillness, pressure continues building quietly inside him, layer after layer, like steam trapped inside iron piping. He grows taller, leaner, quick with his hands. The world around him keeps teaching the same lesson in different forms. Remain useful, remain careful, remain aware of where you stand. Work arrives early in life. Odd jobs first. Carrying loads. Running errands. Watching older men disappear into factories or rail crews before dawn and return home bent with fatigue after dark. Labor surrounds everything. Even silence feels worked upon here. But stories about elsewhere continue surviving inside him with unusual persistence. France remains less a country than an atmosphere. A place imagined through fragments repeated over years until repetition itself gives them weight. Streets without constant fear. Men judged by service instead of skin. Uniforms carrying dignity rather than humiliation. Whether entirely true or not matters less than the possibility they create. Hope does not always require certainty. Sometimes it only requires direction. By adolescence, the tension between staying and leaving has settled permanently into his thoughts. You can feel it in the way he studies passing travelers. In how carefully he listens when sailors speak near the docks. In the fascination he holds for movement itself, trains, ships, roads disappearing towards cities whose names sound impossibly distant from Georgia clay and summer heat. The violence of the era remains difficult to separate from ordinary life. Lynchings are discussed indirectly, almost ritualistically, through lowered voices and unfinished sentences. Entire communities carry the knowledge of sudden danger like a second nervous system beneath the skin. Children absorb these tensions before fully understanding them. Fear becomes environmental. It settles into posture, timing, and instinct. One afternoon, smoke drifts above the rail yard while freight workers unload timber beneath the sun. The air smells of tar, sweat, and wet rope. He watches men from different places shouting across the platform in accents he cannot identify, and for a moment the station feels larger than the town surrounding it. Movement again. Constant movement. Cargo arrives. Cargo disappears. Faces pass through without routes. Eventually the decision forms less like courage and more like inevitability. He leaves young. Younger than the roads ahead deserve. America begins falling behind him mile by mile, not with triumph but with uncertainty. Ports replace fields. Salt replaces dust. The Atlantic waits beyond crowded docks thick with laborious, shouting foremen, and the smell of fish packed in melting ice. Ships loom overhead like floating factories, their hulls blackened by smoke and ocean weather. Crossing the ocean in the early 20th century is not graceful. The lower decks carry damp air mixed with engine oil and bodies packed too closely together. Sleep arrives in fragments beneath the endless vibration of machinery. Waves strike the hull through the night with the heavy rhythm of distant artillery not yet heard but somehow foreshadowed. Around him travel workers, drifters, performers, migrants, men escaping debts or histories difficult to untangle. Most carry little. Many carry silence. The sea changes people slowly. Time stretches strangely aboard ships. Days dissolve into weather, meals, and horizon lines that never seem nearer no matter how long you stare at them. You begin understanding how distance strips away certainty. Land becomes memory faster than expected. When France finally appears through morning fog, it does not arrive as revelation. It arrives industrially. Cranes. Warehouses. Dock workers moving cargo beneath gulls circling over grey water. Yet even here, something feels altered. The eyes following him do not carry precisely the same calculation he has known since childhood. Foreignness replaces the familiar architecture of American racial hierarchy. Not acceptance. Not equality. But difference. Space enough for ambiguity. Paris breathes differently from the towns he left behind. Cafes spill noise into narrow streets long after midnight. Electric lamps shimmer against rain-dark pavement while musicians play for coins in crowded corners. Languages overlap one another in restaurants thick with tobacco smoke. Soldiers, laborious, artists, and drifters pass shoulder to shoulder beneath apartment windows glowing softly above the boulevards. The city feels alive in all directions at once. But survival still depends on work. Romance fades quickly when rent becomes due. He boxes for money, carries loads, learns routines, learns hunger again in another language. Reinvention sounds beautiful from a distance. Up close, it often resembles exhaustion. You watch him moving through Paris not yet as a soldier, but as a man constructing himself from fragments available at the edges of empire. Foreign enough to disappear. Useful enough to remain. And beyond the cafes and train stations, beyond the boxing halls and crowded apartment blocks, Europe itself is already tightening quietly toward war. Rooms above the boulevard. Morning enters Paris gradually through curtains stained by coal smoke and years of rain. The rooftops appear first, pale beneath a cold layer of cloud drifting low over the city. Chimneys breathe thin ribbons into the air while delivery carts begin rattling along the streets below, wheels striking wet stone in uneven rhythms that echo between apartment walls. Somewhere nearby, a cafe door opens before sunrise, releasing the smell of coffee and yesterday's tobacco into the damp morning air. He wakes in rented rooms that never fully become home. The ceiling above the bed bears water stains shaped like spreading coastlines. Pipes murmur softly behind cracked plaster walls whenever tenants farther down the corridor begin washing for work. In buildings like these, privacy exists mostly as courtesy rather than certainty. Doors close thinly. Footsteps pass close enough to identify by habit. Entire lives unfold through walls built too lightly to contain them. Paris before the war is crowded with people constructing temporary versions of themselves. Painters, sailors, waiters, migrants, musicians, men escaping conscription elsewhere, women rebuilding lives after marriages or disappearances nobody discusses openly. The city absorbs movement constantly, reshaping it into labor, entertainment, or silence depending on what survives long enough to root itself. For him, the days organize themselves around necessity rather than ambition. Boxing first. Training where he can. Working where work appears. The gymnasium's smell of sweat soaked deep into canvas and old timber. Dust floats through shafts of morning light while trainers pace slowly beside heavy bags worn smooth by years of fist striking leather. The men there speak through bruises more often than conversation. Bodies become currency in rooms like these. He learns quickly that endurance impresses people more reliably than charm. A man willing to absorb punishment without complaint earns space others are denied. Fights blur together after a while into heat, breath, and the sound of spectators shifting impatiently around the ring. Some nights he wins enough to eat comfortably for a few days. Other nights he returns to his room with swollen knuckles and little money besides. Yet even exhaustion feels different here than it did in Georgia. In America, labor often carried humiliation beside it, stitched inseparably into the work itself. In Paris, hardship still exists, but not always with the same constant ritual of degradation. The distinction is subtle. Important precisely because it is subtle. You notice it in small moments. A waiter speaking to him without lowering his voice into mockery. A shopkeeper making eye contact naturally rather than cautiously. Men arguing politics beside him in cafes while barely acknowledging the color of his skin at all. France does not become paradise through these details. Poverty remains poverty. Foreignness remains foreignness. But the body relaxes slightly when it no longer prepares constantly for insult. At night, Montmartre glows above the city like something suspended between performance and dream. Music drifts from dance halls through open windows while crowds gather beneath electric lights shimmering against damp streets. Soldiers on leave move through the neighborhoods beside artists and tourists, their uniforms brushing past silk dresses and factory coats alike. Laughter rises easily in some corners. In others, conversations stop abruptly when certain political subjects surface at the tables. Europe before the Great War carries tension strangely. The surface remains elegant. Cafes stay full. Newspapers continue printing theater schedules beside diplomatic disputes. Men debate art movements while governments quietly calculate artillery production and railway mobilization. The continent still behaves as though its future will resemble its recent past. But beneath the boulevards, machinery is already waiting. In the boxing halls, arguments about alliances and assassinations drift between rounds. Serbia, Austria, Germany, Russia. Most of the fighters speak about politics with detached irritation rather than fear. Wars happen somewhere else until suddenly they do not. The city continues eating, drinking, singing, and dancing because modern capitals rarely imagine themselves vulnerable until the moment vulnerability arrives. He moves through these conversations as both participant and outsider. American by birth. Black in a continent obsessed increasingly with nation and bloodline. Yet also strangely free from certain European loyalties hardening around him. Men project assumptions onto foreigners. Sometimes that ambiguity creates danger. Sometimes it creates room to breathe. The summer air thickens over Paris as 1914 approaches. Newspapers spread across cafe tables carrying headlines that grow larger week by week. Mobilization timetables become public discussion. Trains begin filling with young men pretending not to study one another's expressions too carefully. Tailors work late into the evenings repairing uniforms. Military bands perform in public squares while families gather beneath fluttering flags trying to convince themselves that patriotic spectacle and catastrophe are not neighbors. He watches all this from the edges at first. Observation becomes habit again. The city feels restless in ways difficult to articulate directly. Horses startle more easily near crowded intersections. Officers walk faster. Railway stations remain loud long after midnight. Even the cafes sound sharper somehow, conversations overlapping too quickly as if everyone senses time accelerating beneath them. Then mobilization arrives not as a single event but as atmosphere. Posters appear across walls overnight. Men line outside recruitment offices before dawn. Church bells carry across districts thick with cigarette smoke and uncertainty. Women stand beside station platforms gripping gloves or handkerchiefs too tightly while trains prepare to leave eastward toward borders most civilians have never seen. Paris does not fall silent when war begins. It grows louder first. Boots striking pavement. Conductors shouting destinations across crowded terminals. Newspaper sellers waving fresh editions still wet from the presses. Military wagons grinding across stone streets beneath the weight of supplies and ammunition. Entire neighborhoods begin reorganizing themselves around departure. You watch him standing among these currents, no longer merely drifting through Europe but beginning to feel the gravity of something larger pulling at everyone around him. War changes cities before it changes battlefields. The transformation starts in stations, kitchens, queues, and crowded streets where ordinary routines suddenly reorganize themselves around absence. At night the cafes remain open, though the music sounds more fragile now. Waiters move between tables carrying wine and coffee to men already discussing casualties not yet officially announced. Maps appear unfolded beneath yellow lamplight. Fingers trace railway lines toward Belgium and Alsace while rain taps softly against the windows outside. In rented rooms above the boulevard, sleep becomes uneven. Too many footsteps on the stairs. Too many whistles from departing trains. Too many conversations continuing late into the night behind thin apartment walls. The city itself seems unable to settle fully into darkness anymore. And somewhere inside that growing unrest, the question begins forming quietly before it is spoken aloud. Whether a man who fled one country might choose to fight for another. The recruitment offices smell of wet wool, paper ink, and bodies standing too close together for too many hours. Men arrive before sunrise carrying cigarettes, folded documents, and expressions balanced somewhere between excitement and dread. Some speak loudly to conceal uncertainty. Others barely speak at all. Along the walls, officers move through the lines with mechanical efficiency, stamping forms beneath yellow lamps while clerks scratch names into ledgers that seem already too small for the number of lives entering them. Outside, Paris continues performing confidence for itself. Newspapers describe quick victories still waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Crowds gather to watch cavalry columns passing toward the stations, horses gleaming beneath polished leather while brass instruments echo between apartment blocks. Women wave handkerchiefs from balconies overhead. Boys chase marching formations through the streets laughing breathlessly until the soldiers disappear around corners toward the rail yards. Patriotism often begins visually before it becomes emotional. Flags. Music. Uniforms. Motion. Entire populations convince themselves that movement alone contains meaning. Yet beneath the ceremony, another atmosphere quietly develops alongside it. Delay. Separation. Administrative repetition. The early machinery of mass war. He watches from within these rhythms rather than outside them now. The decision to enlist does not arrive like revelation. No dramatic speech. No single turning point. More a gradual alignment between restlessness and opportunity. France had offered him space when America had not. Service begins to feel less like obligation than reciprocity. The French Foreign Legion absorbs men the way ports absorb weather. Quietly. Constantly. Names, accents, histories, debts, disappearances. The Legion is less interested in origins than endurance. Many who enter its ranks carry fractured pasts difficult to summarize cleanly. That anonymity creates its own kind of brotherhood. Not intimacy exactly. Shared distance. Training grounds fill with mud quickly once autumn rain settles over the camps. Boots sink deep beside rows of tents darkened by moisture and smoke. Rifles require constant cleaning. Uniforms never fully dry. The body adjusts slowly to communal exhaustion, snoring beneath canvas, wet blankets, cold meals eaten standing up while instructors shout through the wind. Military life strips individuality first through repetition rather than violence. Wake. Drill. Clean. Carry. Wait. March. Repeat. Time narrows into routines measured by whistles, commands, and meal distribution. Men who once introduced themselves through professions or hometowns begin identifying one another instead through habits. The tall Belgian who sharpens razors after supper. The Spaniard who mutters in his sleep. The quiet American who boxes during rest periods to earn extra cigarettes. You observe how quickly strangers become familiar when confined inside shared discomfort. Not friendship necessarily. Familiarity. War's earliest transformations are often administrative and physical long before they become emotional. The camps at night settle into layered sound. Rain striking canvas overhead. Distant coughing. Boots scraping against mud outside the tents. Somewhere farther off, trains continue moving troops eastward under blackout conditions, their whistles muffled beneath fog drifting low across the countryside. Europe feels vast and crowded simultaneously, entire nations shifting bodies and equipment toward borders now hardening into fronts. 4 black volunteers in French service, the experience remains complicated even in these early months. France offers relative openness compared to the American South, yet empire carries its own hierarchies quietly beneath the rhetoric of Republican equality. Colonial troops arrive from North and West Africa wearing uniforms cut for wars designed by men who rarely imagine the soldiers themselves as equals. Respect exists unevenly. Opportunity exists conditionally. Still, conditions matter. A man measures dignity comparatively when history has denied it consistently elsewhere. The Legion pushes recruits hard because modern war already demands more from the body than older generations fully understand. Industrial artillery changes everything. Endurance becomes more valuable than elegance. Long marches leave feet blistered raw inside soaked boots. Packs grow heavier. Sleep shorter. Instructors correct hesitation ruthlessly because hesitation on future battlefields will kill not only individuals but entire sections trapped beneath artillery timing and machine gun fire. Letters arrive irregularly in camp. Some men receive stacks tied together with ribbon or string. Others receive nothing for weeks at a time. Illiteracy hides quietly among portions of the ranks, forcing soldiers to ask comrades for help reading words from wives, mothers, or children far away. Around lantern light after evening meals, voices soften while letters pass from hand to hand. War begins separating civilians and soldiers emotionally long before death enters the equation. He studies French carefully during these months, absorbing vocabulary through necessity and repetition. Military language comes first. Commands, directions, measurements, insults. Then gradually the subtler rhythms of ordinary conversation begin settling into place. Language changes how foreignness feels inside the body. Each sentence spoken cleanly reduces isolation slightly. By winter, the glamour surrounding the war has already begun thinning around the edges. The casualty lists grow longer in newspapers. Trains returning westward now carry wounded men alongside fresh recruits heading east. Hospitals overflow into converted schools and municipal buildings smelling of antiseptic, damp linens, and coal smoke. In cafes near the stations, Conversations pause whenever ambulances pass outside. The front itself remains distant for many in training, yet evidence of its appetite appears constantly now. Officers returning from combat speak less theatrically than before. Veterans arriving briefly behind the lines carry mud permanently embedded into their uniforms no matter how carefully they clean them. Some stare too long at ordinary objects during meals, as though relearning civilian dimensions after weeks under bombardment. One evening after drill, rain settles lightly over the camp while lanterns flicker against rows of soaked canvas tents. The men eat quietly, spoons scraping metal bowls in tired rhythms. Beyond the perimeter fences, railway lines disappear into darkness toward the northeast where the war continues widening mile by mile. You watch him sitting among the others, uniform damp at the cuffs, listening to conversations shifting gradually away from adventure and toward endurance. Nobody speaks openly about fear yet. Not directly. Instead, they discuss weather conditions near the front, ammunition shortages, mud depth, the difficulty of sleeping near artillery. This is how industrial war first enters the imagination of ordinary men. Not through glory, through maintenance, fatigue, waiting, rumor, and somewhere beyond the rain-dark horizon, the trenches are already deepening into the earth. Earth that remembers water. The trenches smell first of wet soil disturbed too often by human hands. Beneath the sharper odors of smoke, sweat, oil, and unwashed wool, the earth itself remains present constantly, exposed and reshaped mile after mile across northern France. Clay sticks to boots in heavy layers that seem determined to pull men backward with every step. Rainwater gathers in shallow depressions beside duckboards warped from moisture and weight. Entire sections of trench wall sag inward slowly during the night, as though the land is trying to close over the wounds carved into it. By the time he reaches the front, the war has already abandoned many of its early illusions. Movement has slowed into entrenchment. Uniforms darken quickly beneath mud and soot. Artillery speaks more often than rifles. Men live underground now, surrounded by timber braces hammered hastily into collapsing walls while rats move confidently through the darkness searching for crumbs, paper, or sleeping warmth. The front stretches across Europe not as a line but as a condition. An immense belt of exhaustion dividing fields, villages, forests, and rivers into zones measured by bombardment. The journey toward the trenches unfolds gradually through layers of diminishing comfort. Rail cars first. Then supply roads crowded with wagons sinking deep into mud. Then marching routes where the sound of artillery grows clearer hour by hour until the body begins anticipating distant concussions before the ears consciously register them. Veterans along the roads no longer react visibly when shells land somewhere beyond the horizon. New arrivals still do. You watch him studying these men carefully. Their uniforms hang differently now than those in the recruitment posters back in Paris. Shoulders bent slightly forward. Faces grayer beneath stubble and fatigue. Movements economical. Nobody wastes energy unnecessarily near the front. Even conversation changes shape here, shortened by cold and repetition. The trenches themselves appear almost disappointingly ordinary at first glance. Narrow corridors of mud reinforced with wood scavenged from forests, barns, or ruined houses. Telephone wires disappearing into mist. Ammunition boxes stacked beneath tarpaulins darkened by rain. The catastrophe of modern war hides strangely well inside routine infrastructure. Morning arrives quietly on some days. A pale sky above torn fields. Frost settling lightly over sandbags while men heat coffee over tiny stoves shielded carefully from observation. Boots scrape against duckboards slick with moisture. Somewhere farther down the line, A soldier coughs continuously beneath a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Then artillery begins again, and the entire landscape resumes trembling. Industrial bombardment changes the nervous system slowly. At first, every shell demands attention. The body flinches automatically. Muscles tighten. Thoughts narrow instantly toward survival. But the front cannot sustain that level of fear continuously. Human beings adapt because they must. After weeks beneath bombardment, distinctions emerge unconsciously inside the mind. Distant artillery. Incoming artillery. Harmless overshoots. Dangerous proximity. The body learns timing before language can fully explain it. This adaptation frightens some men more than the shells themselves, because normalization feels dangerously close to surrender. In the Legion sectors, languages overlap constantly beneath the sound of the guns. French, Spanish, Italian, Arabic, German, English. Orders pass through accents shaped by continents and empires converging inside the trenches of northern France. The Legion functions less like a national army than a temporary republic of displaced endurance. Men carry fragments of former lives into the mud with them, though fewer speak openly about the past now. The front compresses identity toward immediate conditions. Hunger, fatigue, weather, survival. At night, the trenches narrow psychologically. Darkness alters distance. A coughing fit 2 traverses away sounds suddenly intimate. Water drips steadily from timber overhead into helmets positioned beneath leaks. Somewhere beyond the parapet, repair parties move through shell holes under blackout conditions carrying wire, tools, and stretchers. The war rarely sleeps entirely. It merely lowers its voice. He learns trench routines through repetition rather than instruction manuals. How to keep socks dry as long as possible. How to sleep despite artillery vibrations passing through the ground beneath the body. How to distinguish between the sounds of outgoing and incoming fire. How to eat quickly during bombardment pauses because pauses never last predictably. The weather governs everything. Rain transforms trenches into canals of thick brown water swallowing equipment and strength alike. Men bail continuously using helmets or broken tins while engineers struggle to reinforce collapsing walls with timber already rotting from exposure. In winter, frost hardens the mud temporarily before thaw returns and undoes everything again. Seasons cease functioning aesthetically here. Weather becomes logistical pressure. You observe how war reduces entire civilizations toward elemental relationships: earth, metal, water, cold, fire. Letters arrive intermittently even at the front, though many remain unopened for hours or days because emotional distance begins feeling safer than emotional attachment. Some men read the same pages repeatedly beneath candlelight until the folds nearly disintegrate. Others stop writing home altogether after enough bombardments blur the distinction between tomorrow and chance. The front also creates unusual forms of intimacy. Men shaving one another before dawn because mirrors are scarce. Hands steadying cigarettes during shellfire when trembling becomes too obvious to ignore. Shared blankets during freezing nights. Silence held together between strangers who understand exhaustion too thoroughly for unnecessary speech. One evening the rain stops briefly after days of uninterrupted drizzle. Fog settles low over no man's land while the shattered remains of trees stand motionless against the grey horizon like burnt matchsticks pressed into mud. Across the wire, the enemy trenches remain mostly invisible except for occasional flickers of lantern light carefully concealed beneath tarps and dugout entrances. For a few moments, the guns fall silent enough that smaller sounds emerge from the darkness. Water dripping into shell holes. Boots shifting against duckboards. someone quietly humming near the reserve trench. And beneath it all, the strange breathing sound the front makes when thousands of exhausted men wait for violence to resume. Dawn rarely arrives cleanly at the front. The sky lightens in hesitant layers while mist clings low across the cratered ground between the trenches, softening the broken landscape just enough to disguise its damage for a few moments. Men emerge slowly from dugouts smelling of damp wool and stale smoke, shoulders stiff from sleeping against timber walls slick with condensation. Some speak immediately to reassure themselves that ordinary conversation still exists. Others move through the morning silently, conserving warmth and thought alike. The artillery usually begins before breakfast fully settles in the stomach. At first, distant batteries. Then closer impacts following uneven intervals impossible to predict comfortably. Earth trembles beneath the duckboards while loose dirt falls from trench walls onto helmets and blankets below. Tea ripples inside tin cups. Somewhere farther down the line, someone curses loudly after slipping into waist-deep mud beside a collapsed firing step. The front resumes its endless labor of erosion. He adjusts gradually to the rhythm of bombardment, though adjustment is never the same as acceptance. That distinction matters. Men at the front often continue functioning long after emotional comprehension has narrowed beyond language. The body learns procedures first. Duck at certain sounds. Wait after others. Move only when ordered. Sleep whenever possible regardless of noise. Eat before appetite disappears again. The Legion sectors remain crowded with accents from across Europe and beyond it. Empires have brought their margins here. Colonial troops from North Africa clean rifles beside Spaniards fleeing poverty. Italians share cigarettes with Belgians too tired to remember why they once argued politics so passionately in training camps. The trenches flatten certain distinctions while sharpening others. Hunger becomes universal. So does fatigue. Yet race, class, and nationality still drift through the ranks in quieter forms, shaping who receives trust easily and who must earn it repeatedly. 4 black soldiers in French service. Visibility carries strange contradictions. Some officers treat them with pragmatic indifference. Others romanticize them through colonial stereotypes dressed as admiration. A few resent their presence entirely. Yet compared to the rigid violence of the American South, even imperfect ambiguity can resemble relief. The war does not erase hierarchy. It merely reorganizes it beneath greater pressures. You watch him learning these tensions carefully, the same way he once studied rail yards and city streets. Observation remains survival. Which officers value competence over prejudice? Which men become dangerous after drinking? Which sectors receive heavier bombardment? Which veterans speak quietly because they understand too much already? During quieter stretches between shelling, routine takes over again with almost unsettling normality. Rifles cleaned. Sandbags repaired. Latrine trenches deepened. Meals distributed from steaming containers carried carefully through mud slick enough to swallow boots whole. Modern war depends less on heroics than maintenance. Entire armies survive through endless small acts repeated beneath catastrophic conditions. The trenches produce a peculiar relationship with time. Hours lengthen unbearably during bombardments, yet disappear entirely during exhaustion. Days lose sharp edges. Men begin measuring memory instead through rotations, offensives, seasons, and casualty lists. Before Verdun. After the gas attack. During the heavy rains. Human chronology reorganizes itself around survival events. At night, the dugouts fill with dim lantern light and tired breathing. Some soldiers write letters carefully despite trembling hands caused by cold or nerves. Others stare silently at the timber ceilings overhead while artillery vibrations travel through the earth into their bones. Sleep comes unevenly near the front. The mind never fully relaxes because the ground itself might erupt without warning. One soldier nearby keeps photographs wrapped carefully inside oilcloth to protect them from moisture. Another sharpens knives obsessively whenever shellfire grows heavy. Small rituals emerge everywhere. Habits against helplessness. He boxes sometimes during reserve periods when conditions allow it. Not formally. Brief matches arranged between exhausted men trying to remember their bodies as something besides instruments of survival. Crowds gather around makeshift rings scratched into mud while cigarettes pass from hand to hand beneath grey skies. For a few minutes, violence regains recognizable rules. Movement. Timing. Skill. The simplicity comforts people more than they admit aloud. Then the artillery resumes and the illusion disappears. The front absorbs villages slowly. Churches lose roofs first. Then windows. Then entire walls collapse into roads crowded with supply wagons and stretchers. Fields once measured by harvest cycles become landscapes measured instead by crater depth and burial detail placement. Cows wander abandoned farms beside broken artillery limbers half submerged in mud. Civilization does not vanish suddenly in war. It decays structurally, piece by piece, until normality survives only through memory. One freezing evening, he stands watch near the parapet while sleet drifts across no man's land in thin diagonal lines. The wire ahead glistens faintly beneath clouded moonlight. Somewhere across the darkness, German soldiers endure the same weather inside their own trenches carved into the same exhausted earth. Occasionally voices carry strangely through the night air when the guns pause long enough. Coughing. Tools striking timber. Once, distant singing softened by fog. The proximity unsettles many men more than hatred does. Industrial war forces enemies into continuous coexistence. The front becomes less a battlefield than a shared condition of endurance separated by artillery schedules and wire. You observe how this realization changes soldiers gradually. Propaganda weakens beneath prolonged exposure to ordinary suffering. The enemy remains dangerous, deadly, yet also cold, tired, hungry, and waiting beneath the same weather systems moving across Europe without loyalty to either side. Weeks pass, then months. The body hardens unevenly. Sleep shortens. Reactions sharpen. Emotional distance expands in places where fear once lived openly. Men stop discussing victory with confidence now. The war has become too large for individual certainty. Entire generations are being reshaped underground while governments continue printing patriotic slogans far behind the lines. And somewhere inside this vast machinery of mud, exhaustion, and steel, another transformation begins quietly around him. The sky starts pulling his attention upward. Above the trenches, the same weather. The first aircraft he sees near the front appear almost fragile against the enormous scale of the war surrounding them. Thin wings stretched over wooden frames. Canvas trembling beneath crosswinds. Engines coughing unevenly before takeoff while mechanics hold the fuselage steady with gloved hands darkened by oil and cold. Compared to artillery batteries or troop trains, the machines seem improvised, temporary, too delicate to survive modern warfare for long. Yet the men watching them lift into the grey sky follow their movement with unusual attention. In the trenches, soldiers learn quickly that aircraft alter the emotional geometry of the battlefield. The sky no longer belongs entirely to weather or birds. Observation now arrives from above. Coordinates. Photography. Artillery correction. Entire bombardments depend increasingly on men suspended over the front inside aircraft built from fabric, wire, and courage not always distinguishable from fatalism. For him, aviation begins first as fascination rather than ambition. During reserve rotations behind the lines, he lingers near airfields whenever circumstances allow. The aerodromes spread across flattened farmland scarred by rain and wheel tracks, their hangars smelling of fuel, wet canvas, and burned castor oil. Mechanics move constantly between aircraft carrying tools, propellers, fuel hoses, ammunition belts. Nothing here feels stable. Everything vibrates with urgency. The pilots themselves appear strangely detached from the mud-bound exhaustion consuming the trenches. Scarves wrapped high against the cold. Goggles resting above tired eyes. Heavy boots striking frozen ground beside aircraft waiting in rows beneath the morning mist. Some carry themselves with theatrical confidence. Others with quiet concentration. Many are very young. But the romance surrounding aviation fades quickly up close. Aircraft require endless maintenance because the machines are barely ahead of disaster even under ideal conditions. Wings warp from moisture. Engines seize unpredictably. Landing gear splinters against uneven ground. Pilots disappear into cloud cover and never return, not always because of enemy fire. Sometimes weather alone is enough. Sometimes mechanical failure. Sometimes simple navigational error above a front already obscured by smoke and winter fog. You watch him studying not merely the pilots but the system surrounding them. The crews repairing bullet holes in canvas under freezing rain. The armorers feeding ammunition belts carefully through chilled fingers. The observers climbing into rear cockpits carrying cameras, maps, and sidearms whose usefulness feels increasingly symbolic at altitude. The war in the air still belongs partly to improvisation during these years. Tactics evolve faster than manuals. Squadrons learn through loss. Every patrol teaches new lessons about visibility, engine performance, altitude sickness, and fear. Eventually, the possibility of transfer toward aviation emerges before him not as fantasy but as extension. Another form of service. Another environment shaped by endurance and risk. The French military, strained by the endless demands of the war, increasingly values men who can adapt quickly. His injuries from ground combat and his growing familiarity with military routine make the transition conceivable where earlier it might have seemed impossible. The training fields feel strangely open after months near the trenches. Sky replaces overhead timber. Wind replaces the suffocating stillness of dugouts. Yet aviation carries its own forms of confinement. Training schedules. Mechanical discipline. Technical memorization. Pilots survive only through routine layered carefully against chaos. Mornings begin before sunrise. Frost gathers over wings while instructors inspect aircraft beneath pale lantern light. Engines start reluctantly in the cold, propellers chopping through fog that smells of fuel and damp grass. Students learn first on the ground. Engine maintenance, map reading, weather interpretation, emergency procedures repeated until repetition becomes instinct. Flying itself arrives gradually, taxiing first across uneven fields while instructors shout corrections over the engine noise. Then short hops barely separating wheels from earth. Then wider circles over countryside transformed below into rivers, villages, and roads no longer confined by trench perspective. Altitude changes the emotional shape of the war. From above, the front resembles an immense scar stretching across the continent, smoke drifting from artillery zones into cloud cover while railways pulse continuously with movement and supply. The first solo flights leave many pilots trembling afterward, though few admit it openly. The aircraft react constantly to wind and imbalance. Canvas wings shudder unpredictably. Engines sputter during climbs. Sudden silence at altitude becomes every aviator's nightmare because silence often means gravity reclaiming authority from machinery. He learns quickly because observation has prepared him for systems all his life. Watch carefully. Adapt quietly. Understand routines before challenging them. The same instincts that once helped him navigate Georgia rail yards and trench sectors now follow him into aviation. Still, acceptance inside military aviation remains conditional. Some officers respect competence immediately. Others tolerate him only because wartime necessity expands boundaries temporarily. France continues offering opportunities unavailable in the United States, yet the structures of empire and race persist here too, subtle in some places, blunt in others. Inclusion fluctuates depending on commanders, circumstances, and visibility. At the aerodromes, however, practical survival often overrides ideology. Aircraft do not remain airborne because of theory. They remain airborne through discipline, coordination, weather judgment, and luck. Men trusted in the air earn a form of credibility difficult to dismiss entirely. One afternoon, low clouds drift across the training grounds while mechanics secure aircraft against rising winds expected by evening. Nearby, pilots returning from patrol remove gloves stiffened by cold altitude air. Their faces carry a peculiar exhaustion different from trench fatigue. Less muddy. More distant somehow. Eyes strained from scanning endless horizons and tiny movements far below. The war above the trenches remains quieter than the artillery war beneath it, but not gentler. Aviation introduces solitude into industrial conflict. A pilot rises into enormous skies carrying only engine noise, instruments, and awareness that mechanical failure can erase him far from witnesses or burial parties alike. You stand beside the edge of the field watching aircraft disappear one by one into the clouds above northern France, their engines fading gradually into the same grey sky hanging over the trenches below. And for the first time since leaving America, movement no longer points merely across land or sea. Now it points upward. The airfields never fully sleep. Even after sunset, lanterns continue moving between hangars while mechanics work beneath canvas shelters striped with rain and shadow. Tools strike metal in muted rhythms. Fuel drums roll slowly through mud carved deep by transport carts and landing wheels. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, artillery still pulses along the distant front, its dull concussions reaching the aerodromes several seconds late like weather arriving from another world. Pilots live beside machinery so constantly that the smell of oil begins settling permanently into gloves, scarves, and blankets. Engines must be checked before dawn, after landing, during rain, during frost, after every patrol. Canvas wings loosen under moisture. Wire tension shifts subtly during temperature changes. Small failures become fatal at altitude. Aviation during the Great War remains close enough to invention that every flight carries traces of experiment within it. He settles gradually into the routine surrounding military aviation, though the transition from trench soldier to pilot is less dramatic internally than outsiders later imagine. War has already taught him repetition, fatigue, and obedience to systems larger than individual desire. The environment changes. The conditions evolve. But endurance remains the true language connecting both worlds. Morning patrols begin in darkness more often than light. Crews move through the mist carrying lamps shielded carefully against wind while frost glitters faintly along the aircraft frames. Engines cough a live one after another, propellers whipping cold air across the field hard enough to sting exposed skin. Pilots climb into narrow cockpits layered in wool, leather, and uncertainty. Then the aircraft begin lifting slowly into the pale horizon, wheels separating from Earth with awkward grace. Flying over the front changes distance itself. Villages that require hours to cross on foot shrink into clusters of rooftops and smoke. Trenches become thin ruptures winding through fields scarred white by shellfire. Supply columns resemble insects moving steadily along damaged roads. Yet altitude does not create emotional safety. It merely exchanges one form of vulnerability for another. The cold above the front enters the body relentlessly. Wind cuts through gloves and collars no matter how tightly clothing is layered. Eyes water behind goggles while engines roar continuously loud enough to erase ordinary thought. Pilots communicate through gestures because speech disappears instantly into the air behind them. The sky isolates men even while surrounding them with vastness. You watch him adapting to these conditions with the same quiet observational discipline that carried him through earlier worlds. Engine vibration becomes familiar. Crosswinds become readable. Fear remains present but grows structured through routine. Human beings can survive astonishing levels of danger once danger acquires procedure. Combat in the air still lacks the mechanized scale aviation will later reach during the Second World War. Encounters often emerge suddenly from cloud cover or sunlight, aircraft spotting one another over the lines before maneuvering awkwardly through freezing air thick with engine smoke and tracer fire. Pilots remain close enough during engagements to see faces, scarves, even expressions beneath goggles for brief impossible moments. Yet the mythology of aerial warfare conceals its exhaustion. Most flights involve observation, patrol, navigation, and waiting. Hours scanning landscapes for movement nearly invisible from altitude. Long stretches of cloud and silence interrupted unpredictably by violence measured in seconds. The body returns from patrols cramped, numb, and overstimulated from vigilance. After landing, the airfields fill again with maintenance rituals. Mechanics inspecting bullet holes. Armorers replacing ammunition drums. Pilots removing heavy coats with hands still trembling slightly from cold and adrenaline. Coffee heated over field stoves. Cigarettes shared beneath rain-dark hangars while men reconstruct patrols through fragmented conversation. The war above the trenches develops its own emotional weather. Some pilots become louder over time, chasing spectacle against the constant proximity of death. Others grow increasingly quiet, their attention narrowing toward technical details and survival probabilities. Many disappear between breakfast and evening without ceremony. One empty cot. One absent aircraft. Another name quietly removed from the roster. Loss functions differently in aviation than in the trenches. Infantry casualties often vanish collectively beneath artillery and mass assault. Aviation losses feel singular. Visible. An aircraft spiraling downward through cloud cover leaves witnesses staring upward long after it disappears from sight. Sometimes burning wreckage marks the horizon for hours. Sometimes nothing returns at all. 4 black aviators in French service. Visibility carries another layer entirely. His presence inside military aviation remains unusual enough that some fellow pilots regard him with curiosity before familiarity. Newspapers occasionally romanticize foreign volunteers while ignoring the complexities of race beneath such stories. Admiration and exoticization drift close together in wartime Europe. Opportunity exists, but rarely uncomplicated. Still, the cockpit alters certain social boundaries temporarily. Competence in the air creates practical trust. Men who patrol together depend on one another too directly for ideology alone to sustain distance indefinitely. Shared danger compresses abstraction. A pilot covering another during combat matters more in the moment than theories about race produced far from the front. One afternoon the clouds break briefly after days of rain, exposing long stretches of northern France beneath pale winter light. Rivers glint silver between shattered villages while artillery smoke drifts sideways across the horizon in enormous grey bands. He flies above the lines watching shell bursts flower silently from altitude before the sound reaches him seconds later through the freezing air. For a moment, the war appears almost unreal from this height. Too large. Too organized. Railways carrying endless supplies eastward. Columns of men threading through roads like dark currents between ruined forests. Entire nations feeding themselves steadily into machinery spread across hundreds of miles. Then anti-aircraft fire rises from the ground below, black bursts opening suddenly against the sky around the aircraft, and abstraction disappears instantly back into survival. By evening, rain returns over the aerodrome. Mechanics secure the aircraft beneath canvas covers while pilots drift toward barracks smelling of damp wool and engine oil. Lantern light flickers against puddles deep enough to reflect broken pieces of the hangars upside down. Inside the mess hall, voices remain subdued tonight. Another pilot missing after patrol. No confirmation yet. Just absence settling quietly over the tables while spoons scrape metal bowls and cigarettes burn low between tired fingers. You sit beside the silence with them for a while, listening to the storm gather beyond the field. And somewhere beneath the clouds stretching over France, the trenches continue waiting in darkness below the same weather. Cities that pretend the war is far away. Paris during wartime learns how to divide itself into separate emotional worlds existing side by side without fully touching. Along certain boulevards, cafes remain crowded late into the evening while orchestras play beneath yellow electric light and waiters move between tables balancing wine glasses with practiced calm. Only a few districts away, hospitals overflow with wounded men carried from trains arriving continuously from the front. The city survives through compartmentalization. Pleasure beside grief. Routine beside catastrophe. When he returns from patrol rotations or training detachments, the contrast unsettles him more with each passing year. The streets still glow after rain. Theater posters still cling to walls dampened by winter fog. Couples still walk beneath chestnut trees along the avenues speaking quietly about ordinary concerns. Yet war has entered the architecture now in ways impossible to ignore completely. Women dressed in mourning black waiting outside ministry buildings. Veterans moving carefully with canes beside crowded tram stops. Entire cafes falling silent whenever casualty bulletins appear in the evening newspapers. Paris behaves like a city attempting to remain itself through sheer repetition. Morning deliveries continue. Bakers open before dawn. Street sweepers move along the gutters pushing rainwater and cigarette ash toward the drains. Yet absence grows visible gradually inside ordinary routines. Fewer young men behind market stalls. Empty chairs in restaurants where regular customers once sat nightly. Apartment windows remaining dark month after month because nobody returned to relight them. You watch him moving through these streets with a peculiar dislocation common to soldiers briefly removed from active fronts. The body returns physically before the mind follows. Sudden noises still sharpen attention instinctively. Crowded train stations feel overwhelming after open skies and isolated aerodromes. Even civilian conversation sounds strangely fragile when compared to the brutal simplicity of military routine. In the evenings, smoke gathers thickly inside jazz clubs and dance halls where expatriates, officers, laborers, and performers blur together beneath dim light. Paris continues attracting displaced people despite the war because displacement itself has become one of Europe's dominant conditions. Refugees from occupied territories. Colonial soldiers between deployments. Foreign volunteers unwilling or unable to return home. Artists surviving through performance while governments reorganize entire populations around mobilization. For black expatriates especially, the city still offers forms of freedom difficult to abandon despite growing instability. Music, boxing, nightlife, conversation. Spaces where identity expands slightly beyond the suffocating structures waiting across the Atlantic. Yet even here, acceptance often depends on novelty, performance, or usefulness. Wartime tolerance remains conditional because all tolerance built atop instability eventually is. He boxes occasionally during leave periods, sometimes in smoky venues crowded with soldiers spending wages before returning east again. The audiences cheer violence differently now than before the war. More intensely. Less innocently. Entire societies conditioned by industrial death begin craving distraction capable of overwhelming thought for a few brief hours. The clubs themselves pulse with exhaustion disguised as celebration. Women dance with men who may disappear within weeks. Musicians perform beneath ceilings stained dark from tobacco and years of crowded evenings. Laughter rises quickly but fades just as fast whenever conversations drift back toward Verdun, the Somme, casualty lists, or missing relatives. War remains present even in pleasure because absence occupies every room eventually. One rainy night, he sits near the back of a crowded cafe while jazz drifts softly through cigarette haze hanging beneath the lamps. Outside, military trucks grind slowly across wet pavement carrying supplies toward rail depots along the eastern lines. Inside, civilians continue eating, drinking, flirting, arguing politics. Human beings protect themselves psychologically by preserving fragments of ordinary life long after ordinary life has structurally disappeared. The pilots returning from the front often gather separately from infantrymen, though not intentionally. The air war produces its own atmosphere of fatigue, different from trench exhaustion. Less muddy, more isolated. Pilots carry long silences back from the sky. Too much distance. Too much weather. Too much time spent suspended between cloud layers and artillery smoke watching tiny movements below determine whether hundreds live or die. Some aviators compensate by becoming louder in civilian spaces. Drinking heavily. Chasing spectacle. Others retreat inward completely. Their eyes continue scanning ceilings, windows, exits, weather conditions even while sitting safely indoors beside music and warm food. He notices these changes in himself gradually. The inability to relax fully inside crowds. The instinct to study train timetables automatically. The way rain striking cafe windows suddenly recalls sleet against cockpit goggles over the front. War reorganizes memory through association. Paris at night intensifies these sensations because the city insists on continuing despite everything. Taxis splash through puddles beneath glowing street lamps while newspapers announce offensives beside advertisements for theater performances and perfume. Lovers kiss beneath balconies while military funerals pass through neighboring districts the following morning. Civilization and collapse move together here so closely that separating them becomes impossible. You observe how this contradiction reshapes people slowly. The city teaches endurance through performance. Smile. Dance. Drink. Work. Continue. Even while entire generations vanish eastward into artillery fire. One evening, blackout precautions briefly darken portions of the city after rumors of possible air raids circulate through the neighborhoods. Streetlights extinguish one by one along the boulevard until Paris sinks into an unfamiliar shadow broken only by scattered windows and cigarette embers glowing red beside cafe doors. Conversations soften instinctively beneath the darkness. For a few moments, the capital feels vulnerable rather than eternal. Then the rumors pass. Lamps return. Music resumes. But something has shifted. Modern war no longer belongs only to distant fronts. It has begun pressing quietly against the walls of the city itself. Winter settles heavily over Paris during the later war years, muting the city beneath fog, coal smoke, and fatigue difficult to separate from the weather itself. The Seine moves darkly beneath the bridges while thin rain drifts across the boulevards almost every evening, turning reflected lights into trembling streaks across the pavement. Cafes remain open because cities at war cannot afford emotional stillness for too long. People continue gathering beneath warm lamps, not always out of joy, but because solitude has become dangerous. The hospitals near the rail terminals fill steadily after major offensives. Ambulances arrive at irregular hours carrying men wrapped in blankets stiff with mud and dried blood. Nurses move through the corridors smelling of antiseptic and damp wool while trains continue unloading the wounded outside beneath clouds of steam. Entire municipal buildings transform into recovery wards lined with iron beds placed so closely together that whispered conversations drift continuously through the rooms long after midnight. He visits fellow servicemen there sometimes during leave periods. Aviation casualties often differ visibly from trench injuries. Burns. Fractures from crashes. Damage caused not by shells directly but by altitude, engine failure, falling debris, shattered propellers. Pilots speak quietly in hospitals, perhaps because flying already isolates men psychologically before injury confines them physically as well. One young aviator he knew only distantly stares for several minutes at the ceiling before finally speaking. He says the silence after an engine dies at altitude feels wrong in a way difficult to explain to people on the ground. Not peaceful. Empty. As though the world itself has stepped backward suddenly and left the body alone with gravity. Outside the hospitals, Paris continues performing resilience. Theaters reopen after temporary closures. Posters advertise music halls beside casualty notices pinned to government walls. Flower vendors still appear along the avenues even during shortages because beauty retains economic value during catastrophe. Human beings cling fiercely to symbols of continuity once continuity itself becomes uncertain. Yet shortages now shape daily life more openly. Bread lines lengthen during cold mornings. Coal deliveries arrive late. Restaurants quietly reduce portions while pretending nothing has changed. In poorer districts, children wear coats indoors because heating fuel disappears into military priorities before civilian comfort. The war enters households gradually through subtraction rather than explosion. You watch him moving through these neighborhoods increasingly as both insider and observer. France has given him uniform, purpose, movement, and forms of recognition unimaginable in Georgia. Yet complete belonging still remains elusive, suspended somewhere between gratitude and distance. He exists inside the nation's wartime machinery while remaining partially outside its deeper social inheritance. That ambiguity follows him everywhere now. In certain cafes, he is greeted warmly by name. In others, strangers still stare slightly too long before deciding how to interpret his presence. Wartime France expands boundaries under pressure, but expansion does not erase structure entirely. Colonial assumptions remain embedded inside the empire's imagination even when black soldiers bleed for it. Still, the contrast with America remains impossible to ignore. Letters and newspaper reports arriving from the United States carry reminders of segregation, racial violence, and exclusion severe enough that returning across the Atlantic feels emotionally distant even while technically possible. Europe may not offer equality, but it offers breathing room. Sometimes survival depends not on finding justice fully, but on finding conditions less openly suffocating than those left behind. The aviation war intensifies meanwhile. Aircraft grow faster. Patrols longer. Casualties heavier. The skies above France fill increasingly with machines built specifically for destruction rather than observation alone. Dogfights erupt suddenly over cloud banks and shattered villages, while anti-aircraft batteries multiply across the countryside beneath them. Pilots age rapidly during prolonged conflict. Not physically at first. Emotionally. Their humor sharpens. Their silences deepen. Many stop discussing the future beyond immediate assignments because the arithmetic of survival has become too unstable. Every returning patrol feels provisional. At the aerodromes, mechanics now work through the night routinely beneath blackout lanterns and freezing rain. Aircraft arrive riddled with bullet holes or missing sections of fabric entirely. Ground crews repair damage quickly because replacement pilots remain easier to find than replacement machines. Industrial war values continuity above sentiment. One evening after returning from patrol, he walks alone along the Seine while mist drifts low over the water beneath the bridges. The city sounds quieter tonight. No orchestras spilling from open doors. No crowds gathered beneath the cafes. Only footsteps, distant engines, and the soft movement of the river carrying reflected lights downstream toward darkness. War narrows people internally over time. The world becomes organized around immediate necessities. Weather conditions, fuel levels, orders, rest periods, letters arriving or failing to arrive. Entire emotional landscapes shrink toward survivable dimensions. Yet Paris resists total narrowing more stubbornly than the front. Even now, somewhere behind shuttered windows, musicians continue rehearsing. Lovers continue arguing softly over dinner tables. Children continue falling asleep while tram bells echo faintly through rain-dark streets. Civilization persists not because it defeats war, but because fragments of ordinary life refuse extinction completely. He pauses beside the river, watching barges move slowly beneath the fog. Across the water, apartment windows glow amber against the cold while church bells sound somewhere beyond the rooftops. For a brief moment, the city appears almost untouched. Then another ambulance passes behind him toward the station district, its engine echoing through the empty boulevard, and the illusion breaks again. You stand beside the river with him, listening to the sound fade into distance. The war has lasted long enough now that many people no longer remember clearly what peace once felt like in the body. And high above the sleeping city, beyond the fog and cloud cover, aircraft continue crossing the night sky toward the front. The sky becomes routine. There comes a stage in prolonged war when danger stops feeling exceptional and begins arranging itself into ordinary schedules. Men wake beside it, eat beside it, complain about weather delays affecting it. Fear remains present, but it loses sharp edges through repetition until survival itself becomes procedural. By the later years of the war, the aerodromes of northern France have entered this condition completely. Morning patrols depart whether pilots feel prepared or not. Engines must be warmed before dawn. Fuel lines checked. Ammunition loaded. Flight routes revised according to shifting fronts and weather reports arriving through telephones that crackle faintly inside drafty operations rooms. Entire systems now exist purely to keep aircraft moving continuously over the trenches. Aviation has transformed from novelty into infrastructure. The airfields reflect this change physically. Early improvisation gives way to organized efficiency. Hangars expand. Maintenance crews specialize. Logistics tighten around schedules dictated by offensives unfolding below. Rows of aircraft stand ready beside fuel carts and ammunition crates while mechanics move between them with the exhausted precision of factory laborious. Even mud begins looking industrial here, churned by wheels, boots, engines, and rain into thick corridors of movement repeated daily. He rises before first light most mornings now, body adapting automatically to the rhythms of aviation service. Wool layers. Gloves. Goggles checked carefully against cracks or loosened straps. Coffee swallowed quickly while the horizon remains dark blue beyond the hangars. Nearby, mechanics curse softly while turning frozen propellers through the cold. No one speaks much before takeoff. The silence carries concentration rather than dread. Pilots understand by now that emotional dramatics waste energy needed elsewhere. Men preparing repeatedly for danger often become quieter over time, not because fear disappears, but because fear has settled too deeply into routine to require constant acknowledgement. You watch him moving across the field beneath lantern light while frost crunches beneath heavy boots. Aircraft engines begin roaring awake one by one across the aerodrome, vibrations rolling through the cold morning air like distant machinery inside a factory beginning another shift. The comparison feels increasingly accurate. Industrial war has mechanized the sky. Takeoff remains physically awkward despite technological advances. Aircraft bounce over uneven ground before lifting gradually into the air, wings trembling against crosswinds rising over the frozen fields. Then the earth falls away beneath them, and another patrol begins. Above the front, winter clouds drift low enough some days to force aircraft dangerously close to artillery fire. Pilots navigate through smoke columns, sleet, and bursts of anti-aircraft shrapnel blackening the sky around them. Observation flights remain essential because modern offensives depend on information flowing continuously between air and ground. Entire bombardments adjust according to signals sent from men flying above the trenches. The psychological pressure of this responsibility accumulates slowly. A pilot may never see directly the artillery crews altering coordinates below, nor the infantry advancing afterward through shattered terrain. Yet the chain exists. Observation becomes consequence. Distance no longer protects the mind completely from participation. Cloud cover changes combat unpredictably. Some mornings the sky opens clear and sharp for miles in every direction, exposing aircraft immediately against pale winter light. Other days fog and low clouds reduce visibility so severely that pilots emerge suddenly from grey emptiness already within firing range of enemy aircraft. Men disappear into weather and reappear damaged or not at all. The sky acquires personalities just as trenches once did. Calm mornings with steady wind currents. Violent crosswinds near the river valleys. Afternoons when sunlight blinds pilots approaching from the west. Storm fronts moving across the front lines faster than intelligence reports can track them. Veteran aviators discuss weather with almost spiritual seriousness because weather governs survival more consistently than bravery ever does. At altitude, cold enters the body with unusual persistence. Fingers stiffen around controls despite layered gloves. Eyes burn behind goggles while wind forces tears constantly from the corners of the lids. Engines vibrate through the aircraft frames into muscle and bone until many pilots continue feeling the sensation hours after landing. The body never fully relaxes around machinery kept barely under control. He adapts because adaptation has become his defining instinct across every environment he enters. Georgia rail yards. Paris boxing halls. Legion trenches. Aerodromes. Each world required observation before acceptance. Survival before belonging. Yet wartime aviation also creates moments of terrible beauty impossible to dismiss entirely. Dawn breaking above cloud cover while the front remains hidden beneath white mist. Sunlight striking rivers winding silver through damaged countryside. Entire weather systems unfolding silently beneath the aircraft wings while artillery flashes pulse distantly through the clouds below like summer lightning trapped underground. The contrast unsettles many pilots more than combat itself. Beauty beside mechanized death. Stillness surrounding violence. Europe appearing peaceful from certain altitudes while entire divisions bleed unseen beneath the clouds. One patrol near the Belgian sector stretches longer than expected after shifting weather separates portions of the formation. He flies through scattered cloud banks while anti-aircraft fire blooms intermittently below, black bursts hanging momentarily in the freezing air before dissolving into smoke. Somewhere beyond the haze, artillery continues hammering the lines with enough force to vibrate faintly through the aircraft frame. Then another aircraft emerges suddenly from the clouds ahead. Enemy markings. Too close already for avoidance. The distance between observation and violence disappears instantly in the sky. The encounter lasts less than a minute. Later, memory will stretch portions of it strangely while erasing others entirely. The angle of the sunlight against the enemy aircraft's wings. The violent vibration of the engine during the turn. The sharp smell of fuel and cold air inside the cockpit. Yet the sequence itself unfolds too quickly for reflection. Training and instinct replace conscious thought once the firing begins. Aircraft circle awkwardly through cloud-fractured sky above the front, engines straining against steep turns while tracer rounds disappear into mist and open air alike. Early aerial combat still lacks the smooth precision later generations will associate with fighter aviation. The machines resist sharp movement constantly. Wings shudder. Visibility vanishes unexpectedly behind engine smoke or cloud banks. Death often arrives through mechanical miscalculation as easily as enemy skill. You observe how narrow the world becomes inside these moments. No politics. No speeches. No nation except immediate survival. The war compresses itself into wind, altitude, vibration, and the desperate mathematics of positioning. Then the enemy aircraft breaks away through cloud cover and disappears toward the eastern lines, leaving only engine noise and silence behind. Afterward comes the strange emotional emptiness many pilots rarely describe openly. Combat in the sky does not always produce triumph. Often only exhaustion. Adrenaline drains slowly once immediate danger passes, leaving the body cold and overstimulated at once. Pilots continue scanning the horizon long after encounters end because uncertainty remains airborne with them. The patrol reforms unevenly beneath low clouds drifting westward over the front. Aircraft damaged lightly by gunfire maintain altitude while observers mark positions below through gaps in the weather. The war continues regardless of individual fear because the machinery surrounding it cannot pause for emotional recovery. Back at the aerodrome, mechanics inspect the aircraft almost before the engine fully stops turning. Bullet damage attracts quick attention. Torn fabric. Strained control wires. Oil leakage darkening portions of the fuselage. Ground crews study returning machines the way physicians examine wounded bodies, searching immediately for failures requiring repair before the next patrol. Pilots meanwhile drift toward the operations hut carrying maps and exhaustion with equal familiarity. Reports must be filed. Enemy sightings documented. Patrol routes updated. Industrial warfare converts even survival into paperwork eventually. Inside the hut, steam rises from wet coats hung near small iron stoves while officers mark movements across large wall maps crowded with pins and grease pencil notes. Telephone operators relay artillery coordinates through static heavy lines. Clerks record weather changes beside casualty lists. The room smells of damp wool, ink, tobacco, and fatigue accumulated over too many uninterrupted months. He removes his gloves slowly, fingers still stiff from altitude cold, while nearby pilots reconstruct patrol details through fragmented conversation. One aircraft missing briefly during the cloud engagement has returned separately through another sector. Relief enters the room quietly rather than dramatically. Nobody celebrates survival openly anymore. Men simply continue working. That emotional restraint deepens across the aviation corps as the war drags onward. Earlier enthusiasm has thinned into procedural endurance. Pilots no longer speak often about glory or decisive victories. They discuss engines, weather, replacement parts, fuel shortages. Which sectors attract the heaviest anti-aircraft fire this week? The emotional vocabulary of prolonged war becomes technical because technical language feels safer than emotional honesty. At night, the barracks settle into uneasy stillness broken by occasional engine tests continuing outside after dark. Some pilots sleep immediately from exhaustion. Others lie awake listening to rain against the roofs while mentally replaying patrol routes and combat maneuvers over and over until sleep finally interrupts thought by force. The aviation war isolates men socially in peculiar ways. Pilots move constantly between altitude and earth, between enormous silence and sudden violence. Civilian conversation begins feeling distant after enough time spent scanning horizons for enemy aircraft through freezing cloud cover. Even infantry veterans sometimes regard aviators with subtle suspicion, as though flying has altered them into something partially detached from ordinary military experience. Perhaps it has. The sky creates emotional distance through physical distance first. From altitude, entire offensives resemble patterns rather than individual suffering. Troop columns become movement. Shell impacts become geometry. Villages become smoke. The scale required to comprehend industrial war from above risks numbing the human mind simply because no individual nervous system evolved to process destruction unfolding across entire landscapes at once. Yet pilots are never fully detached either. They return repeatedly to fields lined with ambulances, casualty stations, and exhausted mechanics. They see the wounded unloaded from trains. They watch replacement crews arriving younger each month. The war refuses abstraction completely no matter how high aircraft climb above it. One evening after heavy rain, the aerodrome sinks into thick mud reflecting lantern light across puddles large enough to resemble broken mirrors. Mechanics continue repairing aircraft beneath canvas shelters while wind rattles the hangar walls hard enough to drown portions of their conversation. Nearby, an ambulance waits beside the medical hut after a training crash earlier in the afternoon. Training accidents kill almost as relentlessly as combat. Engines fail. Wings collapse. Pilots lose orientation in fog and strike trees or fields before regaining control. Modern aviation still exists close enough to invention that every flight carries risk even in peaceable weather. You watch him standing near the edge of the field smoking quietly beneath the rain while another patrol schedule is posted outside operations for the following dawn. Around him, the airfield continues functioning despite exhaustion spreading through every layer of the system. Aircraft repaired. Fuel delivered. Maps updated. Orders issued. War has become rhythm now. Not climax. Not adventure. Rhythm. And somewhere far behind the front lines, civilians still imagine pilots mostly through newspaper illustrations and patriotic stories printed beneath clean headlines. But out here beneath the rain-dark hangars of northern France, the men themselves are slowly becoming something else entirely. Not heroes. Not symbols. Workers of the sky. The war ends unevenly. The final year of the war does not arrive with clarity. It arrives through accumulation. More exhausted faces at the stations. More aircraft grounded for lack of parts. More officers studying maps in silence before speaking. Entire armies continue moving, fighting, advancing, retreating. Yet beneath the motion another condition has settled quietly over Europe: depletion. By 1918, even the weather seems tired. Spring rain falls over roads already destroyed too many times to repair properly. Villages rebuilt hurriedly after earlier offensives collapse again beneath renewed shellfire. Horses move slowly through the mud beside artillery crews whose uniforms no longer retain consistent color beneath layers of grime and wear. The war continues, demanding energy from populations that have almost none remaining. At the aerodromes, the pace intensifies rather than slows. Aircraft launch continuously during offensives unfolding across the Western Front while mechanics work until their hands crack from fuel exposure, cold, and repetitive labor. Pilots sleep irregularly between patrol schedules revised almost daily according to changing conditions below. The air war has matured into a permanent industrial system now, inseparable from artillery coordination and troop movement. He notices the exhaustion in others before recognizing it fully in himself. Men who once argued loudly during meals now sit quietly staring into coffee cups gone cold. Veterans stop introducing themselves to replacement pilots because too many disappear within weeks. Even the humor at the airfields changes shape. Shorter, drier, more resigned. You observe how prolonged war gradually removes emotional excess from people. Reactions flatten. Expectations narrow. Survival becomes sufficient ambition. Yet signs of approaching collapse drift through the military world in fragments. German prisoners arriving thinner than before. Rumors of shortages behind enemy lines. Entire sectors where artillery fire weakens unexpectedly due to supply strain. Then counteroffensives intensify, and the front begins moving again after years of entrenchment that had made movement itself feel almost impossible. Pilots witness these changes first from above. Roads suddenly crowded with retreating columns. Rail junctions burning beneath bombardment. Villages abandoned in haste. Rivers crossed under constant artillery pressure. The static geometry of trench warfare begins loosening into motion once more, though motion now carries the chaos of systems failing under enormous strain. One morning before dawn, low clouds drift over the aerodrome while crews prepare aircraft for another patrol supporting advancing French forces farther north. The field smells of wet canvas, fuel, and burned coffee. Nearby, mechanics replace sections of damaged wing fabric beneath lantern light while officers review reconnaissance photographs spread across folding tables inside operations. He stands listening to the engines warming through the darkness and realizes suddenly how long this world has existed around him now. Long enough that earlier life feels partially unreal. Georgia. The rail stations. The boxing halls. Even the first trenches. War reorganizes memory by repetition. Recent survival pushes older identities farther away until the past begins resembling stories heard about someone else. The patrol that morning crosses sectors transformed by retreat and bombardment. Entire forests reduced to blackened stumps. Roads clogged with transport wagons, artillery teams, wounded men, civilians carrying possessions wrapped in blankets or tied onto carts. The front no longer resembles fixed lines carved permanently into earth. It resembles movement under pressure. Collapse unfolding unevenly across a continent too exhausted to sustain itself much longer. From altitude, retreat appears strangely orderly at first. Columns moving west. Rail lines crowded with supply trains. Bridges prepared for demolition. But beneath the organization lies desperation increasingly visible through interruption. Burned vehicles abandoned beside roads. Horses left dead in harness. Soldiers sleeping directly against embankments while units continue moving around them. Modern war consumes administrative structure gradually until exhaustion overwhelms planning itself. The air grows more dangerous during these months despite growing Allied advantage. Desperate systems fight unpredictably. Anti-aircraft batteries fire aggressively around retreating positions. Enemy aircraft continue appearing through cloud cover above collapsing sectors where communication between ground and air has become increasingly chaotic. Pilots operate inside a war no longer stable enough even to maintain its own routines consistently. One afternoon, returning from reconnaissance near the northern sectors, he watches smoke rising from several villages along the horizon while long refugee columns move slowly beneath autumn rain. Women carrying bundles. Children wrapped in blankets despite the season. Elderly civilians stopping repeatedly beside the roads to rest before continuing again. Wars end unevenly for civilians. Long after politicians discuss victory and armistice terms, ordinary people continue walking through destroyed landscapes carrying whatever fragments remain transportable. The aircraft circles westward through drifting cloud while the front below shifts restlessly beneath artillery smoke and broken roads. Somewhere beyond the horizon, governments negotiate. Generals calculate. Newspapers prepare headlines anticipating conclusion. But out here in the air above France, the war still feels unfinished because unfinished systems continue functioning exactly as they did yesterday. Engines still require fuel. Pilots still receive patrol assignments. Men still disappear. Even near the end, industrial war refuses sentimentality. At the aerodrome that evening, rain begins again just after sunset. Water gathers along the wheel ruts while mechanics cover aircraft carefully against the weather. Inside the mess hall, rumors move quietly between the tables now. Germany weakening. Negotiations underway. Possible armistice before winter. Nobody trusts rumors anymore. Too many offensives once promised final victory. Too many casualty lists once described as necessary sacrifices before decisive breakthroughs that never truly arrived. So the men continue eating, smoking, sleeping, repairing, flying, waiting not for triumph now, but for interruption. The armistice arrives first as uncertainty. Telephone lines crackle through the morning carrying incomplete reports between headquarters, rail stations, artillery batteries, and airfields spread across northern France. Officers move quickly between buildings holding papers not yet officially confirmed. Mechanics pause beside aircraft engines to listen whenever dispatch riders arrive through the mud. Across the aerodrome, men continue working because war trains people not to trust hope prematurely. Rain drifts lightly over the field before dawn. The aircraft scheduled for patrol stand ready beside the hangars while pilots gather in heavy coats around cups of bitter coffee gone lukewarm in the cold air. Some speak quietly about negotiations. Others avoid the subject entirely. Emotional caution has become instinct after too many years measured by reversals and casualty lists. Then gradually the atmosphere changes. Not dramatically at first. More through hesitation. Orders delayed. Officers speaking in lowered voices. Men glancing repeatedly toward headquarters instead of toward the weather. The machinery of war seems suddenly uncertain whether it should continue moving. You observe how strange this feels after years of relentless procedure. Industrial war depends on rhythm. Wake. Prepare. Deploy. Return. Repair. Repeat. Entire populations have reorganized themselves around that repetition. When interruption finally approaches, the body struggles to recognize it. Near mid-morning, confirmation spreads unevenly across the field. The armistice will take effect at 11. For several minutes, almost nobody reacts visibly. The information hangs over the aerodrome with unreal stillness while engines continue idling nearby and rain taps softly against canvas covers stretched over the aircraft wings. Men look at one another searching unconsciously for emotional instruction that does not arrive. Because endings rarely resemble imagination. No sudden release washes across the field. No collective triumph erupts spontaneously into celebration. Exhaustion has settled too deeply for that. Most simply stand quietly absorbing the possibility that the routines governing their lives may stop within hours. Yet the war does not end immediately even after the announcement. Aircraft already airborne continue flying. Artillery still fires intermittently across sectors where communication lags behind events. Patrol schedules remain technically active until the appointed hour arrives. The machinery slows unevenly rather than halting cleanly. One pilot nearby mutters that men will probably continue dying until the final minute because modern systems rarely stop gracefully once fully in motion. He is correct. The last hours carry peculiar emotional tension across the front. Soldiers wait inside trenches listening to shellfire gradually thinning but not disappearing completely. Pilots continue scanning cloud cover for enemy aircraft despite rumors of ceasefire spreading through every level of command. Entire armies hold themselves suspended between habit and disbelief. At 11 o'clock, silence begins arriving unevenly across northern France. Not absolute silence. The world still contains engines, footsteps, distant voices, horses, wind. But the artillery stops. After years of continuous bombardment, the absence feels physically unnatural. Men emerge slowly from dugouts and trench shelters as though expecting the guns to resume after a few deceptive moments. Some laugh nervously. Others remove helmets and stare across no man's land without speaking. A few cry quietly from exhaustion rather than joy. The front has forgotten how to sound peaceful. At the aerodrome, mechanics shut down engines one by one until only rain and scattered conversation remain over the field. Pilots stand beside motionless aircraft watching clouds drift above landscapes suddenly free from shell bursts for the first time in years. You stand within the silence beside them for a while. It does not feel victorious exactly. Too much has been spent for simplicity. Too many graves already fill the countryside beneath the mist. Too many names have disappeared from barracks rosters, hospital ledgers, family letters. War ends administratively faster than it ends emotionally. That afternoon, church bells begin sounding across nearby towns while civilians gather cautiously in the streets. Flags emerge from apartment windows dampened by rain. Wine appears. Singing begins in scattered districts. Yet beneath the celebration another atmosphere remains visible everywhere, disbelief mixed with fatigue. Europe no longer resembles the continent that entered the war 4 years earlier. Entire regions lie physically shattered. Empires weaken visibly beneath political strain. Millions of soldiers now face the difficult task of becoming civilians again after years organized entirely around survival and obedience. The armistice stops the machinery, but it cannot immediately restore what the machinery consumed. For him, the ending carries additional uncertainty. France has become more than temporary refuge now. It has become the landscape within which adulthood itself unfolded. The uniform gave him forms of dignity and recognition denied elsewhere. The war brutalized him, shaped him, exhausted him, yet also rooted him more deeply into European life than ever before. What comes after such transformation remains unclear. That evening Paris erupts louder than the front. Crowds flood the boulevards waving flags beneath electric lights while music spills from cafes packed beyond capacity. Soldiers embrace strangers in the streets. Church bells echo continuously across the city through cold November rain. Newspapers print enormous headlines announcing peace while vendors shout themselves hoarse at crowded intersections. Yet even here, celebration carries fractures. Hospitals remain full. Train stations remain crowded with wounded men still arriving from sectors where the guns fell silent only hours earlier. Women dressed in mourning black move quietly through jubilant crowds that part around them instinctively. The city rejoices and grieves simultaneously because both conditions now belong permanently to it. Late that night, he walks again beside the Seine beneath drifting mist while Paris continues celebrating behind him. Reflections tremble across the river beneath the bridges. Somewhere nearby, singing rises from crowded cafes while military trucks still move through the streets carrying supplies no longer urgently needed. The silence after prolonged war unsettles many veterans more than noise once did. Without the next patrol, without the next bombardment, without the next order, the mind suddenly confronts empty space where routine once lived. You watch him standing beside the dark water listening to the city breathe around him, aware that one war has ended while another quieter struggle is only beginning. The struggle of deciding where a man belongs once history has already changed him completely. A city between applause and forgetting. Peace arrives in Paris unevenly, like sunlight entering a room still cluttered with debris after a storm. The boulevards brighten first. Cafes expand their terraces again. Musicians return to evening stages beneath smoke-stained ceilings while newspapers replace battlefield maps with political arguments, sporting results, and advertisements promising modern futures already rising from the ruins of Europe. Yet beneath the movement and noise, exhaustion remains embedded deeply inside the city's foundations. The war has ended, but wartime habits continue surviving inside people. Men still wake before dawn without needing to. Women still pause instinctively whenever distant engines echo through the streets. Railway stations still feel emotionally dangerous. Paris after the armistice becomes crowded with uniforms slowly disappearing into civilian clothing. Veterans drift through the neighborhoods carrying invisible traces of trench mud and engine vibration long after washing them away physically. Some adapt quickly. Others linger uncertainly between military identity and ordinary life, as though waiting for another mobilization order that never arrives. For him, the transition unfolds through movement rather than settlement. Aviation recedes gradually from daily routine, leaving behind silence difficult to interpret. No pre-dawn patrol schedules. No operations briefings. No engines warming beneath freezing skies. The body continues anticipating these rhythms automatically for months afterward. Many veterans discover that war does not end when fighting stops. It ends later, slowly, inside the nervous system. Paris, meanwhile, resumes performing itself aggressively. Dance halls overflow nightly with civilians desperate to reclaim years consumed by casualty reports and rationing. Jazz clubs expand across Montmartre and Montparnasse while expatriates, artists, laborious, officers, and drifters mix beneath dim electric light and tobacco haze. The city leans toward pleasure with almost frantic intensity now, as though movement alone might outrun memory. You observe how post-war celebration often resembles exhaustion disguised as joy. People dance harder after catastrophe, laugh louder, drink longer, not because suffering vanished, but because survival itself now requires counterweight. He moves naturally into these worlds of nightlife, boxing, music, and expatriate culture because Paris still offers forms of freedom unavailable elsewhere. Black musicians from America begin arriving in larger numbers, carrying jazz northward across the Atlantic into European cafes and dance halls where audiences hear in the music something modern, restless, and alive after years dominated by artillery and morning bells. The clubs glow warmly against the cold post-war evenings. Brass instruments shimmer beneath stage lamps while waiters weave between crowded tables balancing wine bottles and coffee cups above dense layers of cigarette smoke. Conversations overlap in French, English, Spanish, Italian. Veterans sit beside artists. Colonial soldiers beside aristocrats. The war has fractured old certainties badly enough that new social combinations briefly become possible. Briefly. That word matters. Because post-war openness often contains temporary elasticity rather than permanent transformation. France still remembers him as a veteran. A pilot. A foreign volunteer who served honorably during the war. These identities provide dignity and access unimaginable in the American South. Yet racial hierarchy has not disappeared from Europe simply because the Republic celebrates liberty publicly. Colonial structures remain woven deeply into French society, shaping assumptions even inside spaces that appear cosmopolitan on the surface. Still, comparison shapes emotional reality. A partial freedom can feel immense beside total exclusion. He boxes professionally at times during these years, moving through smoky athletic halls crowded with gamblers, laborious, and spectators eager for distraction. Boxing after the war carries a different atmosphere than before it. Audiences no longer crave only entertainment. They crave intensity capable of overpowering memory. The crowds roar louder now. The violence inside the ring feels closer to something ceremonial. The body becomes labor again. Movement. Endurance. Adaptation. The same conditions repeating beneath different forms. One rainy evening, he sits near the back of a jazz club while musicians play beneath amber lamps reflected softly against wet windows overlooking the boulevard. Outside, taxis hiss through puddles while newspaper boys shout headlines about labor strikes, reparations disputes, and political unrest spreading across post-war Europe. Peace has ended the artillery, but instability continues moving beneath the continent like underground pressure. Inside the club, American expatriates speak openly about race in ways many Europeans find uncomfortable or confusing. Some French patrons romanticize black culture while understanding little about the realities from which these musicians and veterans came. Admiration and misunderstanding drift close together in post-war Paris. He navigates these environments carefully because survival has always depended partly on reading rooms accurately. Which conversations remain safe? Which opportunities carry hidden conditions? Which forms of acceptance are genuine and which rely merely on novelty? Observation remains his oldest habit. At times, the city feels almost miraculous after the trenches and aerodromes. Warm cafes instead of dugouts. Music instead of artillery. Perfume instead of fuel and wet canvas. Yet memory moves unpredictably through veterans. A slammed door recalls shellfire. Thick fog over the river resembles gas drifting across the front. Aircraft passing overhead pull attention instinctively toward the sky even during peaceful afternoons. War leaves behind reflexes long after uniforms disappear. One night after closing time, he walks through Montmartre beneath fading rain while workers stack chairs inside cafes preparing for morning again. The streets smell of tobacco, wet stone, and bread deliveries beginning before dawn. Nearby, a drunk veteran sings softly to himself while leaning against a lamppost beneath posters advertising boxing matches and jazz performances. Paris appears alive again. But not innocent. The city now carries memory beneath its elegance the way old soldiers carry scars beneath their coats. And somewhere inside the growing noise of the post-war world, another quieter transformation begins around him. The slow shift from celebrated veteran toward something more uncertain. A man useful during war, whose place during peace remains undefined. The years after the war settle into rhythms less dramatic than combat but no less shaping. Morning deliveries along narrow streets. Smoke gathering above cafe roofs during winter. Newspapers folded beneath arms on crowded trams while political arguments drift between tables from breakfast until closing time. Europe attempts reconstruction through routine first. Rebuild the railways. Reopen the theatres. Continue. Yet beneath the surface movement, instability spreads quietly through the continent. Veterans search for work in economies strained by inflation and debt. Governments celebrate military sacrifice publicly while struggling privately to absorb millions of men trained for war but not for peace. Political factions sharpen their language. Strikes ripple through industrial districts. Entire societies feel suspended between relief and uncertainty, unsure whether the catastrophe has truly ended or merely changed shape. He survives through adaptation the same way he always has. Boxing. Performance. Connections formed inside expatriate circles and nightlife culture. Paris still rewards charisma and endurance when combined carefully enough. Clubs open and close rapidly across Montmartre while jazz drifts deeper into the city each season, reshaping nightlife with rhythms many Europeans still describe as foreign, modern, untamed. American musicians, dancers, and performers become symbols of a new post-war atmosphere hungry for movement after years of mourning. In these rooms, identity behaves differently than in official France. Nightclubs flatten hierarchy temporarily through noise, alcohol, music, and darkness. Aristocrats dance beside laborious. Colonial soldiers drink beside artists and businessmen. Veterans from different armies share tables without discussing the front too directly. Human beings exhausted by ideology often seek environments where ideology dissolves for a few hours beneath rhythm and smoke. You watch him moving through this world with practiced awareness. Never fully relaxed. Never fully guarded either. The clubs offer visibility, income, and connection, but also dependence on performance. Acceptance in cosmopolitan Paris frequently relies on remaining interesting to the people observing you. That condition can resemble freedom while still carrying instability beneath it. His reputation as a war veteran and aviator opens doors during these years. France remembers certain foreign volunteers warmly, especially those connected to aviation, whose pilots emerged from the war carrying public fascination somewhere between celebrity and myth. Newspapers still romanticize flyers occasionally. Crowds still gather for aviation exhibitions and boxing events where wartime identities can briefly transform into entertainment. But memory shortens quickly in peaceful societies. The war already begins turning into narrative rather than lived catastrophe for civilians young enough to have missed the trenches. Political speeches simplify sacrifice into patriotic mythology. Advertisements reuse military imagery to sell products. Public ceremonies compress years of horror into polished moments of national remembrance manageable enough for crowds to endure. Veterans notice this transformation earlier than most. They hear simplification entering conversations. Heroism replacing mud. Victory replacing exhaustion. Flags replacing amputations and shell shock. One evening, seated near the back of a crowded cafe after a boxing event, he listens while younger patrons discuss the war with confident abstraction despite never having seen the front themselves. Their voices carry excitement rather than memory. Aviation especially fascinates them. Dogfights. Aces. Heroic patrols above the clouds. The reality beneath such stories feels almost impossible to explain without destroying the mood of the room. So many veterans stop trying. Paris, meanwhile, becomes increasingly international during the 1920s. Writers, artists, political exiles, musicians, gamblers, and drifters arrive continuously through the ports and rail stations. The city feeds on reinvention. Entire identities can be rebuilt here if one learns quickly enough how to survive economically and socially within its shifting currents. For Black expatriates from America, this atmosphere remains profoundly significant despite its limitations. In certain districts, men who would face open segregation back home can sit openly in cafes, perform in clubs, or build businesses without constant ritual humiliation structuring every interaction. Europe's racism exists differently. Less codified publicly. More fluid. Sometimes more deceptive precisely because of that fluidity. Still, space matters. Breathing room matters. The body remembers the difference between danger and relative ease even when neither condition is perfect. At times he works security in clubs or moves within circles connected to nightlife management and entertainment. These spaces reveal another side of post-war Paris beneath the glamour tourists imagine. Debt, smuggling, police surveillance, political radicals drifting through crowded bars thick with smoke and rumor. The city remains beautiful, but beauty now coexists openly with exhaustion, addiction, displacement, and instability carried home from the war. Night after night, musicians play beneath dim lights while outside Europe reorganizes itself toward an uncertain future. Germany struggles beneath humiliation and economic pressure. Colonial tensions simmer beneath imperial confidence. Political movements harden around fear, nationalism, and resentment. But inside the clubs, music temporarily suspends larger anxieties. One winter night after heavy rain, he walks home through streets reflecting electric light across black pavement while newspaper pages tumble along the gutters beside him. Somewhere nearby, church bells mark the hour through drifting fog. The city appears calm from a distance. Yet calm in Europe has become fragile now. The war altered more than borders. It altered emotional expectations. Entire populations learned that civilization could collapse mechanically while cafes still served wine and orchestras still performed beneath chandeliers. Once learned that knowledge never fully disappears. You stand beside him beneath the mist listening to late-night traffic moving along the boulevard while smoke rises from apartment chimneys into the cold Paris sky. The uniforms are gone now. The patrols ended years earlier. But history has not released its grip on the continent. And quietly, almost invisibly at first, another generation of pressure is beginning to build beneath Europe's music, cafes, and electric lights. Rooms filled with smoke and listening. By the 1930s, Paris begins sounding different at night. Not quieter, more watchful. The cafes remain crowded. Jazz still spills through basement clubs beneath Montmartre and Pigalle. Waiters continue weaving between tables carrying wine and coffee beneath yellow lamps softened by cigarette haze. Yet conversations now pause more often when certain subjects emerge. Germany. Fascism. Rearmament. Refugees crossing borders farther east. Economic collapse spreading unevenly through Europe like dampness creeping through old walls. The city still performs confidence for tourists, but underneath the performance another atmosphere gathers steadily, apprehension disguised as sophistication. He notices the change gradually because he has spent most of his adult life observing environments before trusting them. Nightclubs, boxing halls, military camps, aerodromes. Every world reveals tension first through small alterations in routine rather than dramatic declarations. A glance held too long. More police outside the stations. Men lowering their voices instinctively when politics enters conversation. The clubs continue operating because Paris survives through continuity whenever possible. Music remains essential precisely because the continent feels unstable again. Crowded dance floors offer temporary protection against anxiety difficult to name directly. Human beings facing uncertainty often seek louder rooms. He moves now through the city less as a young veteran building identity and more as an established figure within certain expatriate and nightlife circles. Some evenings he works. Other evenings he simply observes from the edges while musicians perform beneath warm stage lights and crowds drift between excitement and fatigue. The nightlife world reveals Europe's fractures early because displaced people gather there first. Journalists fleeing political pressure. Jewish refugees arriving from Germany and Central Europe. Former soldiers unable to settle into ordinary professions. Colonial subjects navigating empires that promise liberty publicly while withholding it structurally. At the tables nearest the back walls, conversations overlap in multiple languages while cigarette smoke thickens beneath the ceiling beams. Newspapers pass from hand to hand carrying headlines about Hitler, Mussolini, labor unrest, border disputes. Europe begins speaking increasingly through ultimatums again. You watch him listening more than speaking. Observation remains his safest instinct. The memory of the last war still lives physically inside much of the city. Veterans limp through train stations carrying canes polished smooth by years of use. Older men pause instinctively whenever aircraft engines pass overhead. Entire neighborhoods maintain memorial plaques listing names from 1914 to 1918 beneath fresh flower arrangements renewed each month by surviving relatives. Yet younger patrons inside the clubs often discuss another war with dangerous abstraction. Some imagine it impossible. Others imagine it cleansing. A few romanticize force openly now, seduced by uniforms, nationalism, and promises of restored greatness spreading through European politics. Veterans tend to grow quieter during these conversations. They remember mud too clearly. During these years he becomes connected occasionally to circles where information moves carefully beneath ordinary nightlife. Journalists. Diplomats. Men who ask subtle questions while pretending casual curiosity. Paris increasingly fills with surveillance without fully admitting it publicly. Governments monitor one another through embassies, informants, waiters, performers, and businessmen scattered through the city's social life. Nightclubs become useful precisely because people underestimate them. Alcohol loosens discipline. Music masks conversation. Foreigners blend together naturally. The boundary between entertainment and intelligence gathering grows thinner each year. One rainy evening, he sits near the bar while a jazz quartet plays softly beneath dim amber light reflecting against rows of bottles behind the counter. Outside, fog drifts along the boulevard while taxis move slowly through wet streets lined with posters advertising political rallies beside boxing matches and theater productions. At a nearby table, two German businessmen speak in lowered voices while a French journalist pretends not to listen. Across the room, an American musician discusses segregation back home with a North African waiter who laughs bitterly at the idea that France itself has solved racial hierarchy. Layers of empire, nationalism, and displacement overlap quietly inside rooms like these every night. Paris still appears cosmopolitan from a distance. But cosmopolitanism under pressure becomes fragile quickly. He understands this instinctively because his own life has depended repeatedly on conditions that looked stable until suddenly they were not. The war taught him how rapidly entire systems reorganize once fear and nationalism fully awaken. Outside the clubs, Europe hardens visibly now. Germany rearms. Borders tighten. Propaganda expands. Military parades return to public squares. Aircraft production accelerates again across the continent while newspapers debate peace in tones increasingly detached from reality. The memory of aviation unsettles him during these years more than before. Engines overhead no longer symbolize exploration or wartime duty alone. They suggest repetition. The possibility that Europe may once again reorganize itself around bombardment schedules, casualty reports, and columns of displaced civilians moving westward through rain. One night after closing, he walks through streets nearly empty except for delivery carts and municipal workers washing cigarette ash toward the gutters with long hoses. Dawn approaches slowly behind low cloud cover while church bells sound faintly across the river. Paris appears calm. But it is the calm of a room where people have stopped discussing certain truths aloud because everyone already senses them approaching. You stand beside him beneath the fading nightclub lights, listening to the city breathe around you. And somewhere beyond the eastern borders of France, another machinery is already beginning to wake. The decade narrows gradually toward inevitability, at first through newspaper language, then through movement. Refugees arriving with fewer possessions each month. Diplomats speaking carefully even at private dinners. Train stations crowded with travelers carrying documents wrapped inside coats against the rain. Europe begins behaving once again like a continent anticipating rupture before openly admitting it. Paris absorbs the tension unevenly. Certain neighborhoods continue celebrating late into the night while orchestras play for tourists who still believe the city exists outside history somehow. Elsewhere, political meetings overflow into the streets beneath banners demanding resistance, neutrality, revolution, or order depending on who is speaking and who is listening. He moves through these environments carrying memories most younger men around him do not possess. The trenches. The aerodromes. The silence after artillery stops. Veterans recognize repetition earlier than civilians because the body remembers patterns before governments acknowledge them publicly. One autumn evening, rain falls steadily over Montparnasse while cafe windows glow softly against the darkened streets. Inside, conversations drift from boxing results toward Germany again. Austria. Czechoslovakia. Rearmament. Names that once belonged to diplomatic discussion now carry physical weight in ordinary rooms. People lower their voices instinctively when mentioning Hitler, not because secrecy protects them fully, but because fear has begun entering civilian speech patterns once more. Fear changes cities quietly before war changes them loudly. Police presence increases near railway terminals and government districts. Men in uniforms appear more frequently along the boulevards. Posters urging vigilance begin appearing beside advertisements for concerts and perfumes. The ordinary and the ominous coexist so closely now that separating them requires deliberate effort. You watch him observing these changes with the restrained attention of someone who already understands how quickly modern Europe can reorganize itself around conflict. In the clubs, musicians continue playing because survival often depends on continuation. Audiences still gather beneath warm lights seeking distraction from headlines growing darker each week. Yet the emotional atmosphere has shifted unmistakably. Laughter comes faster but ends more abruptly. Strangers study one another more carefully before speaking openly. Entire rooms feel as though they are listening for something approaching from far away. The nightlife world becomes increasingly entangled with politics and intelligence during these years. Journalists trade rumors with diplomats. Exiles search for news from home. Men pretending to discuss entertainment quietly measure loyalties instead. Information drifts through bars and cafes the way smoke drifts toward ceilings, constantly, invisibly, settling over everything. He occasionally passes details quietly where needed. Observations. Names. Movements. Nothing theatrical. Modern intelligence work rarely resembles adventure. More often it resembles attention applied carefully over long periods of time. A man notices who enters certain rooms repeatedly, Who changes languages mid-conversation? Who suddenly stops visiting old cafes after political arrests elsewhere in Europe? Observation becomes civic duty in unstable societies. 4 black expatriates and veterans in Paris. The approaching crisis carries layered uncertainty. France has offered forms of dignity unavailable in America, yet belonging built during peace can become fragile once nations begin retreating toward fear and nationalism again. Wartime tolerance often narrows quickly under pressure. Foreigners, refugees, colonial subjects, all risk becoming politically inconvenient once societies harden defensively. Still, many remain because leaving feels equally uncertain. Home itself no longer exists clearly for some people. Paris has become the closest thing to permanence available. One cold evening near the end of the decade, he sits in near darkness after closing time while staff stack chairs around the empty club. The musicians have already gone. Only cigarette smoke remains hanging beneath the lamps while rain taps softly against the windows facing the boulevard outside. Across the room, a waiter folds newspapers left behind by customers. Headlines discuss Poland now. Mobilization schedules. Diplomatic ultimatums. The language no longer sounds speculative. The machinery has begun moving again. He studies the headlines without surprise. Only fatigue. Europe learned little from the previous catastrophe except how to organize the next one more efficiently. Outside, military trucks pass intermittently through the wet streets carrying supplies toward rail depots along the eastern routes. The sound echoes between the apartment buildings with uncomfortable familiarity. Veterans notice such sounds immediately because memory attaches itself to machinery more stubbornly than to speeches. The following months alter Paris quickly. Blackout drills. Air raid preparations. Longer lines outside government offices. Maps displayed publicly again in cafes and newspapers. People begin discussing borders the way earlier generations discussed weather. Then mobilization returns fully. The stations fill once more with uniforms, luggage, cigarettes, embraces prolonged slightly too long beneath steam and rain. Another generation of young men boards trains eastward while crowds wave from platforms trying desperately to believe history can repeat itself differently this time. You stand among the noise with him listening to engines warming beneath grey skies over the city. The same whistles. The same boots. The same uncertainty settling over civilians pretending not to feel afraid. Yet this war already feels different before it properly begins. The last conflict exhausted Europe. This one seems prepared to consume it entirely. The occupied city. The fall of France happens too quickly for emotional preparation. 1 month Paris still argues politics in crowded cafes beneath warm evening light. The next, entire roads leading south fill with civilians carrying mattresses, suitcases, bird cages, blankets, children. Movement overtakes certainty almost overnight. Refugee columns stretch across the countryside beneath early summer heat while rumors travel faster than reliable information through every station, village, and roadside cafe. Modern collapse rarely announces itself dramatically at first. It arrives administratively. Missed trains. Contradictory orders. Government offices suddenly empty. Maps revised faster than newspapers can print them. Then military defeat becomes visible physically. Abandoned vehicles along highways. Soldiers separated from units wandering beside refugee traffic. Bridges crowded beyond capacity while aircraft circle overhead searching for roads and rail lines below. Paris changes emotionally before German troops fully enter the city. The cafes remain open for a time because cities resist acknowledging defeat until uniforms physically appear in the streets. Yet conversations soften. Music grows quieter. Waiters stop lingering at tables. People glance upward whenever aircraft engines echo across the rooftops. He watches the transformation with the terrible familiarity of someone who has already seen Europe reorganize itself around war once before. Only this time the collapse feels faster, more mechanical. The confidence of the interwar years disappears almost immediately beneath occupation's approaching shadow. When the Germans enter Paris, the city falls into a peculiar stillness. Not silence exactly. Traffic continues. Markets open. Trams run. But the emotional atmosphere changes completely. Occupied cities learn quickly how to lower their voices. Uniforms appear everywhere now. At intersections. Outside ministries. Beside railway stations and government buildings. The occupiers move with the calm procedural confidence of a system convinced of its permanence. You observe how ordinary routines survive beneath occupation because survival requires continuation even when freedom contracts around it. Bakers still rise before dawn. Delivery carts still move through narrow streets. Musicians still perform in certain clubs because hunger and rent continue existing regardless of politics. Yet every ordinary action now unfolds beneath surveillance. Identity becomes dangerous again in layered ways. Veteran, foreigner, black man. Connected to nightlife circles where information moves quietly between tables and back rooms. All conditions that once created opportunity now carry risk. Paris under occupation develops two separate surfaces simultaneously. The visible city and the hidden one. Visible Paris continues functioning enough to preserve the illusion of stability. Restaurants serving officers beneath glowing chandeliers. Posters advertising performances and films. Couples walking beside the Seine pretending normal life remains possible if carefully performed. Hidden Paris survives through whispers, coded conversations, stolen papers, black market exchanges, radio transmissions carried quietly through shuttered apartments after dark. The boundary between these worlds shifts constantly. A waiter may carry messages. A musician may pass names. A bartender may overhear enough careless conversation to place lives at risk. Nightlife spaces become especially dangerous because occupiers often underestimate entertainment districts while simultaneously depending on them psychologically. German officers drink in the same clubs where resistance sympathizers gather cautiously at nearby tables. Jazz continues playing beneath ceilings stained by cigarette smoke while Europe collapses outside the windows. For black expatriates and colonial subjects, occupation sharpens vulnerability immediately. Nazi racial ideology transforms previously unstable forms of acceptance into open threat. Men who once navigated Paris through performance and adaptability now find the city narrowing around them physically and socially. He remains because leaving occupied France is no simple matter. Borders tighten. Documents determine survival. Movement itself becomes suspicious. The city that once symbolized freedom now behaves like a carefully monitored machine. One evening during the occupation's early months, he walks through Montmartre beneath blackout conditions while German patrols move along the boulevard in pairs, boots echoing against wet pavement. The familiar clubs remain open in reduced form, their windows dimmed carefully against air raid regulations. Music drifts softly through doorways but without the reckless energy of the 1920s. Even celebration sounds cautious now. Inside one club, officers sit near the stage drinking beneath hanging smoke while local patrons avoid eye contact instinctively. Conversations stop whenever uniforms pass too close to certain tables. Fear reorganizes posture before speech. People laugh differently under occupation. Briefly. Carefully. Never too loudly. He understands the danger intuitively because his entire life has involved reading hostile systems before they fully reveal themselves. Georgia taught him that. War refined it further. Occupation simply changes the language of threat. Observation becomes survival again. Which streets remain safer after curfew? Which policemen cooperate too eagerly? Which cafes attract informants? Which conversations should end immediately once certain doors open? The city itself seems to shrink emotionally during these years. Movement becomes restricted not only by regulations but by caution. Entire neighborhoods fall quiet earlier at night. Fuel shortages darken streets once filled with electric light. Hunger spreads gradually beneath the official performances of order maintained by occupation authorities. Still, resistance survives in fragments. Small acts first. Hidden radios. False documents. Quiet refusals. Information passed discreetly through crowded rooms where music attempts unsuccessfully to conceal tension. One rainy night after curfew, he stands near a shuttered doorway watching German vehicles move slowly through the fog along the boulevard below. Their engines echo against buildings still carrying scars from the previous war, while church bells sound faintly somewhere across the darkened city. Paris remains beautiful under occupation. That is part of what makes occupation unbearable. The cafes. The bridges. The river moving silently beneath the lamps. Civilization continuing aesthetically while freedom disappears structurally. You stand beside him listening to the engines fade through the mist. And beneath the occupied city's quiet routines, another slower war has already begun unfolding in whispers and shadows. Occupation changes the meaning of time. Under ordinary life, days move forward through plans, seasons, ambitions. Under occupation, time narrows toward permissions. Curfew hours. Food distribution schedules. Identity checks. The body begins organizing itself around caution so completely that even silence acquires administrative weight. Paris learns these rhythms quickly. Morning queues form outside bakeries before dawn while people clutch ration cards inside gloved hands stiff from cold. Coal shortages leave apartments damp through winter. Restaurant menus shrink quietly as ingredients disappear into military requisition systems. Along the boulevards, German patrols pass storefronts where civilians continue shopping beneath signs and awnings preserved carefully enough to maintain the appearance of order. Occupation depends partly on performance. A city must look governable. He moves through this world with practiced restraint. Former veteran status offers little protection now. Wartime service for France belongs to another political reality already fading beneath German administration and collaborationist bureaucracy. Memory becomes selective during occupation. Nations preserve useful symbols and silence inconvenient ones. For black residents, performers, colonial workers, and expatriates, visibility itself becomes unstable. Some disappear southward when possible. Others retreat socially into smaller circles. Certain clubs close entirely. Others continue operating under reduced conditions because music and alcohol remain profitable even during authoritarian rule. Yet every room now contains uncertainty. Who listens? Who reports? Who survives by informing? You observe how fear changes conversation physically. Sentences shorten. Political opinions dissolve into vague gestures or coded references. People begin speaking through implication rather than direct statement because directness has become dangerous. Entire cities under occupation develop second languages built from silence and omission. Still, information continues moving. Through waiters, train workers, Musicians traveling between districts. Veterans maintaining old connections from the previous war. Resistance rarely begins heroically. More often it begins administratively, hiding documents, carrying messages, observing movements, remembering names. One evening, rain falls heavily over the city while blackout curtains darken the club windows against the street outside. Inside, smoke hangs low beneath the ceiling while a jazz trio plays softly enough that conversations remain possible at the tables. German officers drink near the front beside businessmen and collaborators, pretending not to notice the tension saturating the room. At a back table, two civilians exchange newspaper pages folded in a particular sequence before separating without acknowledgement. Small movements. Ordinary gestures. The hidden life of occupied cities survives through details insignificant enough to avoid notice. He understands these mechanics instinctively because adaptation has defined nearly every stage of his life. Georgia required vigilance. The trenches required vigilance. Aviation required vigilance. Occupation simply compresses vigilance into civilian space. Outside, Paris grows darker each month. Fuel restrictions reduce lighting along the boulevards. More windows remain black after sunset. Public transportation slows. Hunger sharpens tempers in markets and ration lines where civilians argue quietly over shortages impossible to solve individually. Children grow thinner. Elderly men spend entire afternoons searching for firewood or coal substitutes through freezing rain. War reaches cities gradually through subtraction. Less bread. Less light. Less trust. The occupiers, meanwhile, continue organizing the capital with procedural efficiency. Notices appear on walls overnight announcing new regulations, arrests, restrictions, executions. Bureaucracy becomes one of occupation's most effective weapons because paperwork normalizes domination slowly enough that people risk adapting psychologically before recognizing how much freedom has vanished. One winter afternoon, he walks beside the Seine while snow drifts lightly across the bridges and German sentries stand beneath heavy coats near government buildings across the river. The city appears almost peaceful under the falling snow. That illusion feels dangerous. Beauty under occupation often intensifies grief rather than easing it. Paris remains architecturally elegant while morally constricted. Cafes still glow warmly at dusk while deportation systems expand quietly through administrative offices elsewhere in the city. Music still plays while prisons fill. Civilization survives aesthetically long after justice begins collapsing structurally. At times the occupation feels strangely theatrical, as though both civilians and occupiers participate unwillingly in routines neither fully believes permanent. German officers dine beneath chandeliers while outside resistance pamphlets circulate secretly through train stations and apartment blocks. Collaborators perform confidence publicly while privately fearing eventual reversal. Ordinary citizens continue working because survival leaves little alternative. Yet beneath the routines, pressure accumulates constantly. The war beyond France shifts unpredictably. Rumors spread after Allied bombings or Eastern Front disasters. Radio broadcasts listened to secretly after midnight carry fragments of hope mixed with fear. Occupied populations learn to measure morale through whispers because official newspapers no longer contain reliable reality. One late evening after curfew, he listens from an apartment window while distant aircraft pass high above the cloud cover moving northward through the darkness. Their engines echo faintly over the rooftops before fading toward occupied Europe beyond Paris. The sound changes the city instantly. People pause. Windows darken further. Memory returns. Veterans recognize the emotional atmosphere immediately. The uneasy stillness preceding bombardment, uncertainty, movement. Even civilians who never saw the trenches now understand enough to fear engines crossing the night sky. You stand quietly beside the window listening with him while the sound disappears into distance. The occupation has taught the city endurance again. But endurance is not peace. And somewhere beyond the darkness surrounding France, another immense machinery is already turning westward toward liberation, destruction, and the final reshaping of Europe once more. A man the war keeps reusing. By the later occupation years, fatigue settles over Paris with the heaviness of old dust accumulating across furniture left untouched too long. The city still functions, but increasingly through compromise rather than confidence. Trains run irregularly. Markets thin. Coal shortages darken entire apartment blocks through winter evenings while civilians move through ration lines with expressions emptied by repetition. Occupation has become routine now. That realization frightens many people more than the occupation itself once did. Human beings adapt to almost any condition if forced to remain inside it long enough. Curfews stop feeling temporary. German uniforms cease startling civilians automatically. Fear reorganizes itself into smaller daily calculations rather than dramatic panic. Which streets remain safer after dusk? Which police officers can be bribed? Which neighbors speak too openly after drinking? You observe how prolonged pressure narrows life toward maintenance. Acquire food. Avoid suspicion. Continue. For him, the years under occupation deepen an old condition already present across much of his life: usefulness without security. The systems surrounding him keep changing: the American South, wartime France, post-war Paris, occupied Europe. Yet each continues finding ways to use his labor, courage, observation, or adaptability without fully offering stable belonging in return. Still, he continues moving through the city because motion itself has become instinctive. Nightclubs remain partially active despite shortages and surveillance. Musicians still perform beneath blackout curtains while officers drink at front tables pretending culture survives untouched by the war surrounding it. Behind the scenes, however, many clubs function as informal exchange points for information, favors, ration contacts, and rumors flowing through occupied France. He works where possible, watches carefully, listens more than he speaks. Some resistance networks value people capable of blending into complicated social spaces without drawing immediate attention. Nightlife environments reward memory, faces, habits, patterns. Who arrives repeatedly? Which officers drink too much? Which businessmen suddenly acquire privileges unavailable to others? Observation becomes labor once again. One damp evening, he sits near the back corridor of a crowded club while cigarette smoke gathers beneath dim ceiling lamps and a pianist plays softly enough that conversations remain possible across the room. German officers occupy several tables near the stage. At another sits a French businessman speaking too confidently about post-war opportunities under German administration. Nearby, waiters move carefully between them, all carrying drinks, coded glances, and exhaustion. Occupation creates strange proximities. Collaborators beside patriots. Survivors beside informants. Music beside fear. The city survives socially even while trust collapses structurally. Outside, Allied bombing campaigns intensify across Europe. Rail yards burn. Factories disappear overnight beneath explosive firestorms. Refugees move continuously through occupied territories while the Eastern Front consumes men and machinery at scales difficult even for veterans of the previous war to comprehend fully. The war now feels larger than any individual nation. Industrial civilization itself appears trapped inside an accelerating system of destruction impossible to halt cleanly. He hears stories arriving through travelers and whispered conversations in the clubs. Entire Jewish communities disappearing eastward. Resistance reprisals. Villages burned after partisan attacks. Hunger spreading deeper into occupied regions. Europe no longer resembles a continent merely fighting another war. It resembles a civilization exhausting itself. Yet Paris still glows at night in fragments. A cafe lamp reflected against wet pavement. Music escaping briefly through a doorway before vanishing back into the rain. Women in worn coats hurrying home before curfew beneath chestnut trees darkened by blackout restrictions. Beauty persists stubbornly even inside damaged worlds. One afternoon during a cold winter rain, he walks past a military checkpoint near the station district while German soldiers inspect papers beneath canvas awnings dripping steadily onto the pavement below. Civilians wait silently in line, clutching identification documents damp from weather and nervous hands alike. Everyone understands now that bureaucracy determines survival almost as much as courage. Documents. Permissions. Classification. Modern systems reduce human lives toward categories frighteningly quickly during war. As a black veteran of France, his existence itself unsettles Nazi racial assumptions in ways both dangerous and strangely destabilizing. The occupiers never fully understand how to categorize certain people produced by the contradictions of empire, war, and expatriate life. Ambiguity occasionally creates space. More often it creates vulnerability. Still, he remains standing inside occupied Paris years after many expected the city to break entirely. You watch him moving through ration queues, train stations, smoky clubs, rain-dark streets, and apartments heated poorly against winter while history continues pressing against Europe from every direction at once. Another generation of young men fights now in skies and trenches not unlike those he once survived himself. Aircraft engines again dominate the night above France. Convoys again move toward uncertain futures through mud, smoke, and exhaustion. The war keeps reusing conditions. Only the uniforms change. One night after curfew, he pauses beneath a doorway while distant aircraft rumble high beyond the clouds above Paris. The sound rolls slowly across the rooftops before fading eastward into darkness. Nearby, a woman closes her shutters quickly after hearing the engines, movements practiced enough to reveal long familiarity with fear. The city waits constantly now. Waiting for liberation. Waiting for bombings. Waiting for shortages to worsen. Waiting for occupation to end before identity itself erodes completely beneath compromise and exhaustion. And beneath all that waiting, another quieter realization settles over him gradually. Wars do not merely use men once. Some men become environments history returns to repeatedly whenever civilization begins collapsing again. The liberation of Paris begins first as rumor moving faster than certainty through the occupied city. Whispers in ration lines. Voices lowered inside cafes. Train workers passing messages between stations. German convoys moving north more frequently now, their discipline tightened by pressure spreading westward across France after the Allied landings. By the summer of 1944, the atmosphere inside Paris has changed unmistakably. Fear remains, but it now coexists with impatience. Occupations weaken emotionally before they weaken militarily. Civilians begin testing boundaries subtly once they sense permanence cracking. German patrols appear more tense than before. Resistance activity grows bolder. Gunfire occasionally echoes through districts that had remained outwardly calm for years. The city holds its breath between expectation and danger. He moves through these days carefully because collapsing systems often become more violent precisely when they begin losing control. Retreating powers tighten surveillance. Informants grow desperate. Civilians gamble increasingly on rumors that may or may not prove true. Hope itself becomes dangerous under occupation because hope encourages movement before safety exists. Still, liberation approaches physically now. You can feel it in the city's altered rhythm. Barricades discussed openly. Hidden flags emerging cautiously from apartments. People studying Allied aircraft overhead not with dread alone but with anticipation. Paris begins remembering itself before it is fully free. One humid August evening, distant explosions roll across the city while crowds gather uncertainly at intersections listening for further news. Resistance fighters move through side streets carrying rifles hidden for years beneath floors, walls, and cellar rooms. German vehicles pass faster now, less ceremonially than before. The occupiers no longer resemble permanent administrators. They resemble men calculating exits. Then the fighting enters the streets directly. Not everywhere at once. In fragments. Barricades rise from overturned buses, paving stones, furniture dragged hurriedly into intersections. Gunfire cracks between apartment blocks while church bells ring across districts where civilians suddenly flood into the streets after years of forced caution. Smoke rises beside government buildings and rail depots. Paris becomes loud again after too much silence. The city remembers revolution instinctively. You watch him moving through the liberation not as a young soldier chasing glory but as an older survivor already familiar with how quickly celebration and violence overlap during historical turning points. The instincts formed in trenches and occupied clubs remain useful now. Observe carefully, move cautiously, trust slowly. The fighting lasts only days compared to the years surrounding it. Yet emotionally it feels immense because tension accumulated across the occupation finally releases all at once. German snipers still fire from rooftops. Resistance fighters die in streets crowded with cheering civilians. Allied vehicles roll through neighborhoods where children wave flags beside buildings still carrying blackout scars and bullet damage. Liberation scenes later become simplified through photographs and memory. Crowds kissing strangers. Church bells. Flags. Tanks beneath cheering windows. All true. Yet beneath the joy lies exhaustion so deep many civilians can barely process events fully as they unfold. Occupation taught people emotional restraint for survival. Sudden freedom arrives faster than the nervous system can reorganize itself around it. For him, liberation carries additional complexity. France is again the nation he fought for, suffered for, remained inside through multiple historical catastrophes. Yet even in liberation, recognition remains unstable. The Republic celebrates resistance and sacrifice publicly while older racial assumptions persist quietly beneath the rhetoric of unity. Still, the occupation is ending. That fact alone transforms the emotional atmosphere of the city overnight. The cafes reopen fully. Music returns louder. Curfew disappears. Strangers speak openly in the streets without lowering their voices instinctively at the sight of uniforms. Paris exhales after years of constriction. One evening shortly after liberation, he walks beside the Seine beneath warm late summer air while crowds gather along the bridges listening to spontaneous music drifting from cafes crowded far beyond capacity. Allied soldiers mingle beside civilians, resistance veterans, foreign workers, journalists, and survivors emerging slowly from years of concealment. The city glows again, but differently than before the war. Less innocent. More aware of how fragile civilization truly is beneath its architecture and rituals. At a nearby cafe, American soldiers laugh loudly while drinking wine beneath lights reflected softly against the river. Their uniforms pull his attention instinctively because America now returns physically into his life after decades spent largely abroad. Yet the relationship feels uneasy. He fought for France when his own country denied him basic dignity. He remained in Europe through occupation while the United States evolved from distant homeland into abstract memory. Now American power floods liberated Paris through jeeps, cigarettes, jazz records, and military police. History loops strangely around certain lives. One black American soldier pauses briefly after recognizing him from conversation or rumor passed through expatriate circles. For a moment, two generations stand facing one another across the same war-torn continent. One who fled America searching for freedom decades earlier, another arriving in uniform as part of the force liberating Europe itself. The encounter feels larger than either man fully articulates. Because history rarely resolves cleanly. The liberation celebrations continue deep into the night while church bells echo over the rooftops and Allied aircraft cross overhead toward Germany beneath clear skies untouched by blackout restrictions for the first time in years. You stand beside the river with him, listening to the city alive again around you. Paris has survived another war. But survival is not the same thing as restoration. And quietly, already, the machinery of peace is beginning the long process of deciding which people will be remembered publicly, and which will slowly drift back toward obscurity once their usefulness fades again. After the liberation, Europe begins reorganizing itself through paperwork. Borders revised. Governments restored. Military records processed. Decorations awarded. Entire populations sorted into categories of heroism, collaboration, victimhood, or silence depending on what the new political order requires emotionally from the past. Wars end loudly but settle administratively. Paris returns gradually towards civilian rhythm again, though the city now carries visible exhaustion in every district. Buildings remain damaged. Bridges require repair. Food shortages continue despite victory. Train stations overflow with displaced people searching for relatives, employment, or transport toward countries altered beyond recognition during the war years. The cafes fill once more, but conversations have changed. Occupation stories circulate carefully at first, then more openly as fear recedes. Everyone seems to possess a hidden narrative now. Resistance work. Black market survival. Prison camps. Bombings. Betrayals. Waiting. Europe emerges from the war carrying millions of private memories too complicated for public mythology. He moves through the aftermath quietly. The dramatic years are ending around him, though he does not yet fully realize how completely. The skills history repeatedly demanded from him, endurance, adaptation, observation, courage inside unstable systems, suddenly lose immediate urgency once the machinery of war begins shutting down again. That transition unsettles many veterans more than civilians understand. War provides structure even while destroying lives. Peace removes structure first and only later attempts to replace it. For him, post-war life unfolds without triumphal clarity. No grand homecoming. No stable institutional role waiting after decades of service, displacement, and survival. The republic he defended repeatedly continues, respecting him in fragments rather than fully. Ceremonies. Handshakes. Occasional recognition. Yet ordinary economic survival still depends on work available to aging veterans in exhausted societies. He takes jobs where possible. Labor again. The condition underlying nearly every phase of his life returns once more. You observe how history often reduces extraordinary lives back toward ordinary survival once public emergencies pass. Nations celebrate sacrifice abstractly while individuals continue paying rent, carrying boxes, sweeping floors, standing long shifts beneath poor lighting in buildings already smelling faintly of age and dampness. Paris in the late 1940s carries contradictory energies simultaneously. Reconstruction and mourning. Jazz clubs reopening beside hospitals still filled with war injuries. American influence flooding the city through films, cigarettes, military aid, and music while Europe struggles to comprehend the scale of what it has survived. Black American culture expands visibly through post-war Paris. Jazz musicians perform nightly before packed audiences. Writers and artists arrive searching for freedoms unavailable back home. Certain neighborhoods again become spaces where race functions differently than in the United States, though never outside hierarchy entirely. He witnesses these changes not as a young expatriate anymore, but as an aging veteran whose life now stretches across multiple historical eras. The distance between the boy watching trains in Georgia and the older man walking post-war Paris feels almost impossible to measure cleanly. One autumn evening, he sits alone in a cafe near closing time while rain drifts softly against the windows overlooking the boulevard outside. The younger patrons nearby discuss atomic weapons, American films, new political tensions forming between East and West. Already another global rivalry begins replacing the previous catastrophe. History wastes little time resting. At another table, American tourists speak excitedly about Paris as though the occupation belongs to distant legend already rather than fresh memory still lingering inside the city's walls. Veterans notice this transformation painfully. The speed with which catastrophe becomes story. The speed with which sacrifice becomes decoration. The speed with which public memory edits complexity into cleaner shapes. His own life resists simplification too much for easy national myth-making. Black. American-born. French veteran. Pilot. Boxer. Expatriate. Survivor of two wars tied together by exile and service. Too many categories crossing one another for comfortable patriotic narrative. So recognition arrives inconsistently. Some remember him warmly, others vaguely, many not at all. That quiet fading forms its own condition. One winter afternoon, he works a long shift in a building crowded with people too busy to notice him closely. Outside, Paris moves through ordinary routines again. Trams rattling along wet streets, office workers carrying newspapers beneath umbrellas, children chasing one another beside market stalls stacked with oranges and bread. Civilization has resumed. That fact carries both comfort and loneliness. The world continues forward quickly after war, often faster than the people who fought through it can emotionally follow. You watch him standing near a window during a brief pause in work while snow begins drifting lightly over the rooftops beyond the boulevard. The city appears calm, alive, reconstructed enough that younger generations already struggle imagining occupation or trench warfare as lived realities rather than historical images. His life increasingly resembles a corridor connecting eras no longer speaking clearly to one another. The age of horses and trenches. The age of aviation. Occupation. Liberation. Now the atomic century beginning quietly beyond Europe's recovery. And through all of it, the same deeper condition remains beneath the surface. A man repeatedly useful to history, yet never fully absorbed into the nations that used him. Aging arrives gradually for veterans because the body often learns exhaustion long before it learns stillness. Years of vigilance leave traces difficult to remove. Sleep remains uneven. Loud engines still pull attention instinctively toward windows and skies. Certain weather patterns, fog, freezing rain, damp autumn wind, continue reopening sensory memories embedded decades earlier in trenches and cockpits above France. The body remembers atmospheres more stubbornly than chronology. By the 1950s, Paris has changed again around him. Reconstruction smooths over visible scars from occupation and bombardment, while cafes fill increasingly with tourists, students, office workers, and younger artists who know the Great War only through photographs and the Second World War mostly through childhood fragments. The city grows brighter, more commercial, less haunted on the surface. Yet memory still survives in older faces. Veterans sitting silently at corner tables near closing time. Widows placing flowers beneath memorial plaques each November. Men pausing unconsciously whenever church bells echo through fog along the river. History lingers longest inside routine gestures. He continues working because work remains necessary. Public recognition rarely translates into financial security for aging veterans unless institutions deliberately sustain remembrance materially rather than symbolically. Ceremonies honor sacrifice. Employment pays rent. The distinction matters deeply. One morning before sunrise, he rides public transportation through cold winter darkness toward another shift while office buildings and apartment windows remain mostly unlit outside. Around him, commuters sit silently beneath weak carriage lights, holding newspapers folded across tired knees. Ordinary labor has reclaimed the city fully now. Europe rebuilds itself not through speeches alone, but through millions of repetitive mornings like this one. You observe how invisibility grows around aging people in large cities, especially those whose most extraordinary years belong increasingly to historical memory rather than public present. The younger passengers near him do not see the former pilot, the Legion veteran, the expatriate survivor of occupations and airfields and trenches. They see an older black man traveling to work before dawn in a recovering European capital. History compresses strangely in public space. Still, fragments of recognition surface occasionally. A journalist seeking interviews about the earlier war. Veterans remembering names from aviation circles. Ceremonies where medals emerge briefly from drawers and coat pockets before returning afterward to quiet apartments and ordinary routines. Recognition arrives intermittently now rather than continuously. Like distant weather. One afternoon during a veterans gathering, old pilots speak softly over coffee while cigarette smoke drifts toward the ceiling of a modest hall decorated with fading wartime photographs. Many move carefully now, age-stiffening bodies once accustomed to cold altitude air and cramped cockpits. Their conversations circle repeatedly toward absent men. Those who never returned. Those forgotten. Those who drank themselves into silence afterward. Veterans often remember one another more accurately than nations do. Because shared endurance resists simplification. At times, French officials publicly honor his wartime service. Medals. Ceremonial acknowledgements. Recognition from the Republic he defended repeatedly across 2 wars. Such moments carry genuine meaning. Yet they also reveal uncomfortable asymmetry. Honors arrive decades after the hardest years have already passed. Institutions grow more comfortable celebrating individuals once those individuals no longer threaten existing structures through active presence. Delayed recognition possesses its own melancholy. The applause arrives after exhaustion. The gratitude arrives after obscurity. History often waits until memory becomes safe before embracing complexity publicly. Outside official ceremonies, daily life continues with indifferent momentum. Paris enters the modern era fully now. Automobiles crowd the boulevards. American films dominate cinemas. New apartment blocks rise beside streets once shaped by horse carts and wartime troop columns. The city moves forward because cities always do. He grows older within it quietly. One rainy evening near the river, He pauses beneath an awning while traffic passes through reflected neon lights shimmering across wet pavement. Jazz still drifts from nearby clubs, though the music sounds different now than during the interwar years. Faster, sharper, less burdened by survival perhaps. Young couples hurry past laughing beneath umbrellas without noticing the older man standing near the doorway watching the rain. That invisibility no longer wounds him the way it might once have. Aging teaches certain veterans emotional distance from public attention because they understand how unstable attention always was. Nations remember according to present need. Fame rises and falls with politics, anniversaries, and convenience. Survival itself becomes more meaningful than recognition eventually. Still, memory persists stubbornly in quieter ways. The smell of wet canvas during storms. The rhythm of trains departing stations before dawn. The silence after engines stop. The peculiar loneliness of cloud cover above battlefields stretching endlessly beneath winter light. You stand beside him near the river listening to the rain while Paris glows softly across the water beyond the bridges. The city that once represented escape, war, freedom, occupation, celebration, and survival now simply continues around him as ordinary landscape. Time has folded decades together until individual eras blur slightly at the edges. Yet his life remains extraordinary precisely because it refuses clean categorization. America rejected him. France used him. History partially forgot him, then slowly remembered him again. And beneath all those shifting conditions, one quieter truth survives. Some people spend their entire lives crossing borders that societies themselves do not yet fully understand how to cross. The river keeps moving. Years later, the photographs remain still while the century around them continues moving. A young man beside a boxing ring in Paris before the war. A uniform darkened by mud somewhere along the Western Front. A pilot standing near an aircraft stitched from canvas and wire beneath northern clouds. Older images later, ceremonies, medals, aging hands, formal jackets worn carefully for official occasions that arrived decades after the hardest years had already passed. Public memory prefers neat sequences. Beginning, service, recognition. But real lives rarely settle into such clean arrangements. The river moves through Paris the same way it always has, carrying rainwater, light, reflections, cigarette ash, flower petals dropped from bridges during memorial ceremonies. The Seine witnessed him young, foreign, hopeful, exhausted, occupied, liberated, aging. Cities remember differently than governments do. Stone and water preserve atmospheres long after politics changes language around them. At night, the boulevards still glow after rain. Cafes still spill warm light across wet pavement while distant music drifts through open doors during summer evenings. Tourists cross bridges carrying cameras where soldiers once crossed carrying rifles. Young couples sit beside the river speaking softly about futures that feel permanent because youth almost always mistakes the present for stability. Yet history moves beneath ordinary life continuously, like underground water shaping foundations slowly over generations. You stand quietly beside the river watching the city breathe around you. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, aircraft still cross the night sky above Europe. Faster now. Higher. Made from metals and technologies unimaginable to the pilots of 1917. Yet the sound remains strangely similar after enough distance. Engines moving through darkness over sleeping populations below. The century that shaped him has mostly passed now. Empires collapsed. Wars ended. Borders shifted. The segregated America he fled transformed imperfectly across decades of struggle and resistance carried by millions besides him. France changed too, though not always in the ways it promised itself publicly. The world continued reorganizing around newer crises while older veterans disappeared quietly from apartments, hospitals, train stations, and riverside cafes. Recognition eventually came more fully than before. Military honors. Historical acknowledgement. Stories recovered from archives and memory before they vanished completely. But delayed recognition always carries shadow alongside gratitude. Nations often celebrate people most comfortably once those people no longer demand structural change from the present. Memory becomes safer than justice. Still, survival matters. Presence matters. The fact that he remained visible long enough for history to reconsider itself matters. One can imagine the long arc of his life not as triumph exactly, nor tragedy alone, but as endurance across systems repeatedly uncertain how to contain him. The American South. The Foreign Legion. Wartime aviation. Interwar Paris. Occupied France. Post-war obscurity. Each environment attempted classification. None fully succeeded. Perhaps that is why his story lingers. Not because he fit history neatly. Because he exposed its contradictions simply by surviving inside them. A black American who found dignity first beneath foreign uniforms. A pilot before many nations accepted black pilots at all. A veteran of one war who lived long enough to watch Europe repeat itself through another. A man repeatedly useful to history, yet never entirely claimed by it. The rain begins lightly over the river now, soft enough that the surface only trembles instead of breaking. Across the water, lights shimmer beneath low cloud cover while traffic moves steadily through streets rebuilt many times over the last century. Paris remains alive because cities survive through continuity more than purity. New generations inherit old streets without always recognizing the weight of memory beneath them. Yet memory survives anyway. In stations before dawn. In jazz drifting through basement clubs. In old veterans pausing instinctively at the sound of engines overhead. In photographs fading slowly at the edges while faces continue looking outward from another era. The river keeps moving past the bridges toward the sea beyond France, beyond Europe, beyond the borders that once shaped entire lives so violently. Water does not preserve nations permanently. It carries fragments onward. And somewhere inside that movement remains the quiet truth his life leaves behind. That dignity can survive even where belonging remains incomplete. That history often recognizes people long after they have already paid its cost. And that some lives become important precisely because they crossed worlds unable to imagine one another clearly yet. You've been part of Echoes of War, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.